Story 1. I always believed that trust is the most important thing in a relationship. But now, looking back, I understand that trust is not just words. It is a feeling, a state that is built gradually, step by step. He was my first serious boyfriend, and it seemed to me that with him I understood what it means to be truly in love. There was something in him that I could not explain, but it was stronger than any words. His calmness, intelligence, ability to maintain a conversation on any topic, all this attracted me. I remember how we met. It all happened by chance, but at the same time so perfectly. He was a few years older than me, and this added some mystery to him. He was not someone who immediately attracts attention, not a typical handsome guy, but something in his manner of speaking and in his gaze said more than any appearance. I liked the way he listened, how he made decisions, always balanced and thoughtful. He seemed perfect, like a hero from a book with whom you can go through any life's trials and not lose a drop of respect and love. The relationship with him was how I always imagined it. We shared interests, we were comfortable with each other. He always supported me, showing that he valued my opinions and desires. But despite his intelligence and self-control, I felt that sometimes he still wasn't completely open with me. It was hard to explain, but I noticed that there were small inconsistencies in his words, moments when he either kept something quiet or left me alone with questions that he didn't immediately answer. But I decided that it didn't matter. Everyone has their own personal boundaries, and I should respect his space. When he went away to college, I didn't expect it to be so difficult. It seemed like just a few days without him. But already in the first nights I began to feel how much I missed his presence. The city was quiet, and the night hours seemed like an eternity. I often called him, sent messages to keep in touch, but he didn't answer as often as before, and his answers were short. I understood that he was probably busy with his studies, his friends, but some kind of anxiety still burned me from the inside. I didn't want to be clingy, so I tried not to bother him too much. But the next morning when I woke up, there were several messages waiting for me. He wrote that he had been drinking, and that he probably wouldn't answer much because he might need to have fun with his friends. I didn't understand what he wanted to tell me, but I admit, it hurt me a little. He was the kind of person who never showed weakness, and now that I read these messages, I felt like I was seeing a completely different side of him. This was not the guy I knew. When he admitted he might smoke weed, I felt a chill in my chest. It wasn't that I was against it. I hadn't set such strict boundaries in a relationship in a long time, but there was something different about this. I remembered him saying that he never wanted to drink or smoke without me, that it had to be something private, something we did together. I wanted to believe he was serious about that promise, but his actions told me otherwise. He always seemed like a strong-willed person, a person who was in control of his life. I was proud of it. I liked the way he made decisions and followed them. But when I saw him give in on the first night, just because he was among his friends and gave in to the general mood, it became very hard for me. It was not like him. I still believed in his steadfastness, in his words, but now everything was starting to fall apart. I tried to understand why I was so offended. After all, I had told him myself that I didn't mind him drinking or smoking if he wanted to, but it wasn't just my position towards him. It was the realization that I trusted him enough to let him go, to give him freedom in these matters. However, his actions seemed like betrayal to me, although I tried to convince myself that it wasn't so. I felt like my expectations that he would always be true to his principles were beginning to crumble. I lay in bed, not knowing what to do with myself. Time passed, and I kept thinking about what had happened. It seemed like nothing serious, but at the same time, if such small things start to worry me, it could be a signal of something bigger. Maybe his promises were just words. Maybe he was hiding something too. Maybe he didn't care about our connection as much as I imagined. I reread his messages over and over again, trying to figure out what to do, but each time I felt like his words were losing their meaning. It became clear to me that relationships, no matter how perfect they may seem at first glance, require much more attention and honesty than I thought. Trust is not built on beautiful words and promises. It is made up of every little deed, every action that confirms that you can trust a person, that he will not let you down, that he will not back down from his words. And now I was faced with a dilemma. Can I trust him as much as before? After I woke up and read his texts about him drinking and probably smoking weed, I couldn't help but feel empty. I knew it wasn't the end of the world, that it was just a few nights where he found himself in a different environment, and that he hadn't done anything terrible. But deep down, I felt like something important had broken. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a sense of loss, like a small part of me had believed in him more than I believed in myself, and now that faith was cracking at the seams. I tried to reassure myself by reminding myself that I had said that I didn't mind if he drank or smoked. It wasn't something that was strictly forbidden to me, and I wasn't going to deny him moments of joy or relaxation. But when I thought about it in more detail, it became clear that he himself could have made a different choice if it had been really important to him. Why did he give in right away? Why, the first moment he was away from me, did he break that promise? Where was his word? I lay in bed and thought about his messages. He hadn't told me that he drank or smoked because he wanted to. He had said that he probably wouldn't text me much today because he drank. I felt bad that he hadn't tried to be discreet at all, that his first desire in a new situation was complete submission to someone else's influence. It all seemed trivial, but in my heart I felt like this small step was like a crack in the foundation. And if this crack was not noticed and treated, it could eventually lead to much more serious consequences. Gradually, thoughts began to swirl in my head. If he could change his principles so quickly and easily, then what did that say about his attitude towards me? Why didn't he think about how I would feel when I found out about his actions? After all, I told him that I was not against his habits. I understood that it was his decision, his personal choice, but I wanted him to be mindful of my feelings. Why couldn't he have told me earlier that he was going to drink? Why didn't he discuss it? Why didn't he try to be honest, even if it could have affected his behavior? This was the moment when I began to doubt whether he was capable of the kind of honesty and responsibility that I expected from him. I sat at the table, head resting on my hand, trying to sort out my thoughts. Maybe it was just a small thing, and I shouldn't pay so much attention to it. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt that something was wrong. Maybe it wasn't just his action, but how he handled it. He could have done something differently if he hadn't really wanted to ruin my expectations. But that didn't happen. I continued to doubt and feel disappointed, although I couldn't really explain what it was that upset me so much. He was an adult, he could do whatever he wanted. I had said I didn't mind his choice. But with each passing minute, these little doubts began to snowball. I tried to reassure myself by telling myself that he was only 18 and that maybe it was normal for his age to experiment, to try new things. But against the backdrop of his confidence and reasonableness, which I so admired in him, this seemed inappropriate. I found it hard to believe that he would give up so easily. Questions began to haunt me. What if this was just the beginning? What if he had simply gotten used to satisfying the needs of those around him, rather than thinking about what was truly important to him? What if every word, every promise he made was now empty? After all, I had believed him, and now it seemed to me that everything I had believed in was not so stable. I asked myself what kind of person he was, who could change so quickly, who said one thing and did something completely different. But what was even more painful was that I could not talk myself out of these thoughts. I could not simply dismiss it as a minor misunderstanding. It was much more serious. Then I thought, maybe it wasn't just his fault, but mine too. Maybe I expected too much from him. Maybe I believed too much that his words weren't just words, but promises he would keep. Maybe I put him on a pedestal and expected too much from him. Maybe I didn't give him enough freedom to be himself, no matter what we discussed or how I felt about it. But honestly, I couldn't tell myself that I was wrong. My expectations were quite reasonable, and I didn't think he should ignore them so easily. I decided I needed to talk to him to figure out what was going on. But what could I say? How could I explain to him that I was concerned about his behavior when I had essentially said that I was okay with it? How could I express my feelings without blaming him for what he had done, but at the same time letting him know that I valued his word and his honesty? I was afraid that if I started discussing it, things would get even more complicated. But I couldn't keep quiet, because this ball of doubt was already brewing inside me. With each passing day, I realized more and more that this wasn't just a question of smoking or drinking. It was a question of what I expected from him as a person, what I expected from him as a partner in a relationship. Could I trust him in the long run if he changed his mind so quickly and easily? And what if this wasn't the first time? I couldn't understand why it was so hard to sort out my feelings, why this incident seemed so significant. But I knew one thing: I couldn't just forget about it. I have always believed that trust is the cornerstone of a relationship. It is what everything is built on: words, actions, promises. When I first started dating him, I was sure that I could trust him completely. I thought that his intelligence, his maturity, and his ability to introspect made him an exceptional person, and that I could build a strong and sincere relationship with him. He seemed so confident in himself that I began to believe it. But now, a few days after I learned about his behavior, I began to doubt it more than ever before. The first doubts did not appear immediately, but gradually with each new message he sent me. At first, everything seemed insignificant. He had been drinking with friends. He wrote that he would not reply much because he would be having fun. I tried to calm myself, believing that this was just a small carelessness, an accident. But over time, this feeling grew, becoming more and more obsessive and painful. I began to understand that what I considered a trifle was in fact not just a small deviation from the norm. It was a manifestation of his weakness, a weakness that made me doubt his ability to keep his promises and follow his own principles. With each day that passed away from him, it became more and more difficult to ignore these doubts. I couldn't figure out what exactly was bothering me so much. Maybe I had idealized him too much. Maybe I had expected more from him than he could give. But perhaps it was precisely his behavior that seemed so illogical to me. He had always been so level-headed, so decisive in his words and actions. He had never been the kind of person who gave in easily or compromised if it didn't suit his principles. And now that he was away from me, I saw a completely different side of him. This was not the man I knew. His words, his promises, they had lost their power. I remembered him telling me he wouldn't drink or smoke without me. He said it should be something private, something we would do together when we were ready. I believed him. I believed his words, that he would stick to them, that we would build our relationship on mutual respect and trust. But now I began to doubt. Why had he broken that promise? Why, when he was among his friends, hadn't he tried to keep it? Why was it easier for him to give in than to be honest with me? I couldn't help but think that his behavior was a sign of weakness, weakness in the face of circumstances, weakness in the face of the people around him. He was so attached to his company, to their opinions, that he was easily influenced by them, and that surprised me. He had always seemed independent, always followed his convictions, even if they were not popular opinions. And then, he just gave in. I couldn't understand why. Maybe that was the moment when I realized that he was not as strong as I thought, and that maybe his integrity was just a mask. It hurt me to think that he could break his words so easily. It became clear to me at that moment that there simply wasn't a strong enough incentive for him to stay true to his promises. I realized that if he truly valued what we were building together, he would have approached the issue differently. But instead, he simply gave in without thinking about how it would affect me, how it would affect our relationship. I started thinking about what happens when we don't keep our promises. When the person you're in a relationship with breaks their word, it's not just a question of trust, it's a question of their character. I didn't know if I should keep hoping that he would change, that he would go back to who he was before. Or was it just my fault for believing too much in his words, in his determination and self-discipline? I had a hard time accepting that someone I trusted could break his promises so easily. It made me think that maybe there was more weakness in him than I could have imagined. I couldn't figure out what it was about his actions that bothered me so much. Was it my own idealization of him? Was it my own fault for expecting more from him than he could give? I didn't know what to do about it. How do I deal with a man who seems to lose control so easily? Where is the line between support and indulgence? And when can I tell myself that this isn't just a mistake, but a serious problem? I couldn't leave these questions unanswered. I needed to sort out my feelings, understand what I really expect from him, and what I need from this relationship. I had to decide if I could continue to trust him. Could I trust that his promises, his words, his actions were not just another sign of weakness? I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew this situation required more than forgiveness. It required me to make a decision. Was I willing to continue to build a relationship with a man who gave in so easily, who violated his own principles for the sake of convenience? I felt this question growing in my head, becoming more and more urgent. At some point, I realized that this was not just a question of trust, but a question of self-respect. Can I continue to be with a person who cannot resist what is important to me? Can I continue to believe in a person who breaks his own words? Can I still be with him, knowing that he could not resist temptation? Day after day, the doubts in my heart only grew stronger. Every time I opened his messages, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Everything seemed to be as before, but my soul no longer felt that lightness that it had before. I tried to find an explanation for his actions, to come up with excuses, but each new excuse only worsened my internal conflict. With each passing day, it became clearer to me that this was no longer just a question of his behavior. It was a question of how I saw him, how I perceived our world and our future. How could I continue to be with a man who seemed to change his mind so easily, to break his principles? How could a man who promised me that he would not drink or smoke without me break those promises so shamelessly? I tried to convince myself that it was just the influence of his environment, that he might not have had control over the situation. But deep down I knew that it was not so. He was an intelligent, reasonable man, capable of making conscious decisions. And if he decided to take such a step, it was his conscious decision. I couldn't help but think that this was just weakness. He gave in because he was surrounded by people who perhaps didn't share his values. He succumbed to their influence instead of staying true to himself and his principles. And it wasn't just weakness in front of his friends. It was weakness in front of himself, in front of our relationship, in front of what we had built together. I couldn't understand how this could happen. He always said that he found support and understanding in me, that our relationship was important to him. And now it all seemed an illusion. I understood that inside me there was a dislike for his actions, for his weakness, for the fact that he had broken his word. But I could not get rid of this feeling of guilt that appeared every time I began to think about what had happened. After all, I myself had told him that I did not object to his habits. I myself had allowed him to be himself, to be independent. It was I who had allowed him to drink and smoke without putting prohibitions, without demanding that he change. And now, when he had acted as he had, it seemed to me that I had no right to be offended. I had no right to demand from him what he had already broken. I tried to talk myself out of it, but my thoughts only became more and more confused. He hadn't done anything terrible. He was just a normal person who, when faced with a new situation, behaved as anyone would. I tried to understand why I was so shocked by his actions when I said I was okay with it. But it turned out that the problem wasn't that he drank or smoked. The problem was that he broke his promise. The problem was that he didn't keep his word and didn't respect me or our relationship, and that was far more painful than his behavior. I was tormented by the feeling that I could no longer believe his words. I couldn't forget that he had promised me one thing and done something completely different. I couldn't shake the thought that his promises were worthless. Had I overdone it with my expectations? Had I believed his words too much? Had I asked too much of him? But despite all these questions, I still couldn't believe that his behavior didn't matter. I couldn't accept that his action had become so important to me that his words had lost their power. I felt my relationship with him starting to crumble, and I couldn't stop it. I couldn't restore the trust I had before. I couldn't go back to the state where I believed in his words, where I believed he wouldn't do anything that could separate us. And there was not only disappointment in this, but also bitterness. I was hurt that he had given in so quickly, that his integrity had turned out to be just a pretty shell. And I was even more hurt that I had allowed him to do this, that I hadn't been able to prevent his behavior, that I hadn't been able to keep him within the boundaries that seemed natural to me for a relationship. I didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't forget about his promises. I couldn't just accept his explanation that it was an accident or the influence of his friends. I couldn't help but think that if he had broken his principles once, he might do it again. What if his promises, his words, everything he said to me were just words that had no value? I was afraid that this was only the beginning, that he would start breaking other promises, that he would give in to his desires more and more often, forgetting about what was important to both of us. I was afraid that our relationship would turn into a game in which I would only be a spectator, not a partner. I couldn't figure out what to do next. I couldn't push him away because I still loved him, but I couldn't stay with him without knowing if I could trust him again. And all these questions, all these doubts, they haunted me. I felt like my relationship with him was becoming more and more fragile, and I couldn't find a way to get back what was lost. But at the same time, I couldn't afford to stay in a relationship where I couldn't trust my partner. As the days dragged on, I continued to live with this weight of doubt. I tried to distract myself, to immerse myself in studying, to meet with friends, but thoughts about him, about what had happened, did not give me peace. Sometimes I felt like I was worrying too much, that this was just a temporary moment, and that everything would be fine if I just forgot and did not dwell on it. But every time I returned to his messages, to what he wrote to me that night when he was drunk, I again sank into the darkness of doubt and disappointment. I decided to talk to him, but how to do it? How to open up to him about my feelings without seeming too pushy or insecure? How to explain to him that his action, even if small, violated my trust and made me doubt him? I didn't want to blame him, didn't want him to feel guilty, but I couldn't keep silent. I couldn't continue to live with this feeling that he had betrayed me, even if not in something global. When I started planning this conversation, I had a lot of options in my head. One of them was to simply explain my feelings, calmly, without reproach, trying to convey to him that it was important to me that he stick to his words. Another option was to start blaming him, saying that he can't resist temptations, that he's weak and can't be honest. But I knew that such a conversation wouldn't lead to anything good. It would just be a way to pour out all my pent-up anger on him, and it was unlikely to help change anything. I tried to imagine his reaction. He was always so calm and level-headed, and maybe he didn't even realize how much his actions had hurt me. He probably thought it was completely normal, just hanging out with friends, a little alcohol, a little weed. But I knew that for me, this wasn't just a fun time. This was the moment he broke his word, the moment I felt like he wasn't quite the person I thought he was. And it hurt. More and more often I wondered, is it possible to restore trust after such an act? Maybe it was not just a misunderstanding, but something more serious. After all, if he really gave in so easily, if he could not keep his words, then he did not see it as something important. And if so, what am I to him then? The thought that my feelings and my expectations did not matter to him was especially painful. I could not leave these questions unanswered. With each passing day, talking to him became more and more necessary. I knew that if I didn't talk to him, I wouldn't be able to calm down. But on the other hand, I was scared that this conversation could lead to the destruction of what was between us. I couldn't figure out if I should risk it, if I should open up to him completely, or if I should just let it go, pretend that nothing happened, and continue the relationship as if nothing had changed. I wanted to believe that he would understand that this was not just a complaint, not just a whim, but a real problem concerning how we see each other, how we treat our promises and principles. But at the same time, I was afraid that he would not take it seriously, that he would think that I was exaggerating, that it did not matter that much to him. He did not do it out of malice. He did not want to offend me. But what did all this mean to me then? One evening, when I received another message from him, I felt everything rise up inside me again. He wrote that he missed me and was looking forward to seeing me again, that he couldn't wait to see me again. His words were so sincere, but it was so hard for me to believe them after what had happened. I understood that meeting him would only happen if I could overcome this tension, if I could cope with this mistrust. I decided that I would finally tell him everything. It was difficult, because I was afraid that he would not understand. But I could not remain in this state of uncertainty any longer. My heart demanded clarity. I knew that I had to explain to him that his behavior had changed my perception of our relationship, that I could not simply forget about it and continue as before. I could not remain silent any longer. And then came the moment when I could no longer put off the conversation. We agreed to meet, and I went to him with a heavy heart. I didn't know what he would say, or what would happen after that. I only knew one thing. I needed to talk. I needed to get it off my chest. The words I was going to tell him were spinning in my mind. I didn't want him to think that I was simply offended or jealous. I wanted him to understand that honesty was important to me. His words and actions were important. No matter how much I prepared for this conversation, I couldn't predict what would happen next. But I knew that if I didn't tell him what was bothering me, I wouldn't be able to continue this relationship. My heart demanded the truth, and I was prepared for the fact that this truth might be painful. When I came to him, it seemed to me that the whole world around me had become heavy and unbearable. Even the air was filled with tension that I could not ignore. He greeted me as warmly as always, and his smile was as sincere as before. We hugged, and at that moment I felt how all my doubts and worries began to squeeze inside, like a stone that was hard to carry. It seemed that this moment could last forever, but at the same time it was filled with anxiety and anticipation. I sat down next to him, but I couldn't focus on anything other than what I needed to tell him. It was the moment when I realized that if I didn't open my soul to him, if I didn't express my feelings and experiences, I wouldn't be able to live peacefully anymore. My thoughts were in complete disarray. I wanted to be honest, but I didn't want to hurt him. I was afraid that it would change everything that was between us. Every day this situation became more and more painful for me. I tried to hide my emotions, but they weighed down on me like a heavy weight. How could I not feel hurt if he broke his word? How could I just turn a blind eye to the fact that he promised me, and then, without keeping his word, followed the lead of others? I understood that this was not just an act. It was something more. It was a change in the way I perceived him, in the way I saw our relationship. He had broken trust, and although it seemed small, to me it was not. I tried to figure out why he did it. Maybe he just didn't realize how much it would affect me, or maybe he just didn't care about keeping his word. But the more I thought about it, the harder it became to answer. I felt like something was tearing apart inside me. I loved him, but that feeling was starting to make it hard for me to take his actions as lightly as before. I couldn't just tell myself it didn't matter. It did, and I couldn't keep quiet. When I started talking, I immediately realized that the words weren't coming out the way I wanted them to. Everything was mixed up in my head. I wanted to be with him, but at the same time I was angry, disappointed, and vulnerable. I felt vulnerable, as if I was revealing all my weaknesses at that moment. But what was most important to me was that I couldn't continue this internal conflict. I couldn't be with a person whose words I no longer trusted. I couldn't be with him if I didn't feel that there was trust between us, which I had previously valued so much. My heart was heavy, but in this conversation I found the strength to express what was tormenting me. And it wasn't just discontent or resentment. It was real pain, caused by a sense of betrayal that he didn't recognize. I tried to understand why he did this, why he didn't stay true to what he promised me, but I couldn't find an answer that would comfort me. With every word he said, I felt my feelings becoming clearer, and it became easier for me to understand what was most important to me. I didn't want to blame him or accuse him. I just wanted him to understand that his promises mattered to me, that what he said was important not only to him, but to me as well. I was afraid that if he didn't understand that, our relationship would no longer be what it was. I was afraid that it would change everything, but I had to admit to myself that I couldn't ignore my feelings. I couldn't just suck it up and carry on as if nothing had happened. This action had changed the way I saw him, and I couldn't just let that go. I wanted to believe that he could be the person I was happy with, but that was hard now. I knew that after this conversation we might be different. Maybe I would lose some of my trust in him, and maybe that was inevitable. But I also knew that if we didn't talk about it, if I didn't tell him how I felt, then there would be no relationship. In the silence that followed my words, I waited, hoping that he would hear me, that he would understand. But despite everything I said, I still wasn't sure that he truly understood the depth of what had happened. It was scary. I was afraid that our relationship might not survive this conversation. But in that moment, I realized that I couldn't continue to live in this internal conflict. I couldn't hide my feelings any longer. I couldn't keep them inside, hoping that they would go away. I knew it would be painful, that it would change something between us. But maybe this was the step we needed to take to move on, even if it meant facing the fact that our relationship would never be the same. The day after talking to him, I felt like I had gone through some kind of catharsis. We were both silent, and it seemed like everything was still hanging in the air, unclear, undefined. But this silence was no longer so burdensome. I was finally able to say everything that had accumulated, and now I felt relief. The inner burden that had been pressing on me became lighter, but it still remained in a corner of my soul. I knew that there was still a lot of work ahead, but at that moment one thing was important to me. I was no longer afraid to open up to him. After I spoke out, everything around me seemed to change. Not right away, of course, but I realized that now, if something were to fall apart between us, we would at least do it openly. I felt that there was no longer that heaviness that I had feared before. I decided that I would no longer allow fear to dictate my actions. He sent me a few messages, but this time I was in no rush to respond. I needed time to process everything that had been said, and honestly, I just wanted to be alone and think about what I wanted next. My feelings were heightened, and in that moment I realized that I couldn't continue the relationship with him unless I was sure that he truly understood why I was so worried. It wasn't just a moment of dissatisfaction, but a moment where I had to figure out what was important to me in this relationship and how his actions reflected that. A few days later, when we met again, I noticed that everything was different. He was attentive, caring, and a little tense, but that was understandable. He knew that I was worried for a reason. He knew that it was serious and that I could not forget his promise that he had not kept. But despite this tension, I felt that he was sincerely trying to change something in his behavior, that he did not want to lose me. He opened up to me the same way I opened up to him. He admitted that he had done wrong, that he hadn't realized how important that moment was to me when he broke his promise. He didn't try to justify himself. His words were simple, but they sounded sincere. He acknowledged his mistake and said he was willing to work on himself. We both knew that the past couldn't be undone, but there was something important about admitting it and moving forward. For me, it was a big moment. I realized that relationships require not only trust, but also a willingness to learn from your mistakes. We were both young, and perhaps we didn't always understand the consequences of our actions. But that conversation, that moment when I opened my soul to him, allowed us to become stronger. Instead of keeping the hurt and pain inside, I allowed myself to experience it. I didn't hide my anxiety and disappointment, and somehow we both grew in the process. It wasn't easy, but I realized that I couldn't be afraid to talk about what was really important to me. We began to build a new bridge of trust, and although it wasn't easy, I felt like we were no longer just a couple playing by the rules, but people who could honestly share our worries, doubts, and joys with each other. I no longer looked at him as an idealized hero, but as a real person with his mistakes and weaknesses. This did not mean that I stopped loving him. On the contrary, I learned to appreciate him more, because now I saw in him not only an ideal, but also a person with whom I could go through difficulties. He also became more open, began to feel that he needed me not only in moments of happiness, but also when we had problems. We didn't know what the future would hold. There were no guarantees that everything would always be easy, but we decided to move forward, work on ourselves, and not be afraid to admit our mistakes. I realized that it's not what happens that matters, but how we solve problems and learn from each other. Our relationship changed, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new stage where we could be honest, not hide our feelings, and not be afraid to face difficulties. I realized that it's not necessary to be perfect. The main thing is to be sincere, and if both people are ready to work on themselves and openly discuss problems, the relationship only gets stronger. We were young, inexperienced, but with each passing day we became stronger and closer to each other. Story 2, we had been together for 6 months. 6 months that seemed like a kind of wave jumping. Sometimes he was close, sometimes far away, sometimes everything was fine. Sometimes something was wrong, and I was on the edge again. My life was full of bright impressions and emotions. We rode bikes in the park, watched movies, went to cafes. But something was alarming me, as if I was missing something important. And then we got back from Hawaii. It was amazing, the ocean, the beaches, the time together. We had been planning this trip for months, and it was perfect. I really felt like it was something important. We talked a lot, laughed, enjoyed each other endlessly. But then we got home, and everything started to change. He was in his own world. I noticed it right away when we got in his car and drove home. "Do you want to meet up on Thursday?" he asked with that easy way he always did, as if it was something ordinary. "I can't tonight, but what about tomorrow?" I answered because I thought we could spend another evening together, like we usually did. I needed it. I felt like we needed it. But his answer sounded too casual. "Yeah, let's do it tomorrow." It didn't feel like that. Usually he was more interested in meeting up, in spending time together, and now he seemed to have lost all interest. A couple of days passed, and I asked again, "Are you planning anything for Friday night?" He answered something vague about going on a motorcycle ride with a friend, and I felt doubt creeping up inside me. "Are we going to spend the evening together?" I asked, trying to figure out if his words meant that maybe he wasn't interested in me anymore. And so when he said, "maybe later," I felt something tighten inside me. It wasn't just a suggestion of time, but as if he was ready to choose something else, something he was more passionate about than me. It was a feeling of disrespect that I couldn't ignore. I waited for him to say something like, "Of course I'm with you," or "Yeah, I'd like to spend the evening with you, too." But instead I heard uncertainty and a slight detachment. I tried to force myself to understand that maybe I was being too demanding. Maybe I shouldn't have worried so much. He couldn't always be there. He had his own friends, his own interests. I tried to be objective, but at that moment it was hard to stay calm. Inside, I felt vulnerable, as if he simply didn't want to spend time with me, as if our plans were something insignificant to him. I didn't know what to do with these feelings. Should I leave it as it was or try to understand his point of view? I couldn't decide. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that something was wrong. And the more I tried to justify him, the more I felt that these justifications were simply not believable. He had always been attentive to me, and then suddenly this coldness. I decided to ask him out on Friday night despite his motorcycle plans. He apologized, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his apology was empty. He didn't even try to explain why this was more important to him than spending time with me. He didn't say a single word that would reassure me. Instead, I was left feeling like my feelings didn't matter. Hours passed. I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, trying to figure out how to respond to all of this. Deep down, I knew I couldn't just keep pretending everything was okay. I couldn't ignore how his distance was affecting me. It was like a cold shower. He was so close, yet so far away. Questions were popping into my head that I couldn't answer. Why is he ignoring me? Why was he so quick to choose his motorcycle ride? What happened to that guy who was always there? With each passing minute, I felt more and more hurt and depressed. It wasn't just disrespect, it was betrayal. And not because he chose the motorcycle, but because at the moment when I needed his attention, he decided that I wasn't that important. He didn't understand how painful it was for me. For some reason at that moment, it seemed to me that he no longer valued our union, our plans together. All I felt was a sense that his interest in the relationship had faded, and I simply couldn't ignore it. In those moments, while I sat in silence, I began to doubt the future of our relationship. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but my heart couldn't help but feel that something was broken. He was different. I was different. And all of this was falling apart. With every action he took, with every disregard for my feelings. A few days passed like this, and I realized that it was time to make a decision. I couldn't continue to live in a relationship where I felt unwanted. My self-esteem was starting to drop, and I couldn't afford to stay in that relationship. I deserved more. And I knew that this wasn't just some minor disagreement. This was something much bigger that I couldn't ignore. As time went on, my inner insecurity grew stronger. I kept trying to justify him, but thoughts about how he treated our evening did not leave me. All those questions that I asked myself that evening did not leave me now. Why did he do this and not another? Why did I fail to feel that I was important to him again? For the second night in a row, I found myself in an empty apartment. He had somehow disappeared. I didn't even try to call him. If he decided to come back, he would. But by this time, I was convinced that something fundamental had changed in our relationship. I felt the gap between us growing wider, and my attempts to restore closeness becoming less and less successful. It took me a while to figure out why the bike was more important to him than time spent with me. Had I gotten too attached to the moment? Had my expectations been too high? But with each day that I spent alone, I realized that it wasn't the bike that was really bothering me, but the fact that I was in a situation where my feelings were being pushed to the side. For some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about how busy he was with his own things when I needed his support and attention. Why were my needs suddenly unimportant to him? He had always been the kind of person who listened and supported me. I remembered him looking for a restaurant for me on my birthday, making breakfast in the morning so I could sleep in. He was attentive, caring, and I saw in his actions a sincere desire to make me happy. But now something had changed. He had become more closed, more distant. Something had changed in him, and I couldn't figure out what it was. This moment of wariness was a sign to me that something was wrong, and maybe I just couldn't ignore my feelings anymore. A few days passed. He called again, said he wanted to see me, and I agreed. But in my heart, I no longer felt the confidence I had felt before. I was no longer so calm. When I met him, he was smiling as always, but something in his look, in his behavior, told me that he had changed. The words he spoke sounded the same as before, but something in his tone was different, as if he was no longer the person I had once made plans with. We met in a cafe, and I felt it was important to talk. I wanted to understand what was really going on, but the moment I started talking about my feelings, he started to retreat. He didn't argue, didn't make excuses, didn't try to explain. He was just silent. His silence was like a blow. He didn't say anything, didn't try to clarify the situation. He didn't want to go deeper into the conversation, didn't want to discuss the problems. And at that moment, I realized that I was missing this conversation. I was missing him telling me that everything would be okay, that he understood everything, that our relationship was important to him. His silence spoke to me more than words. It was like an admission that he didn't want to fight anymore. He didn't want to solve the problems that had arisen. That silence was what sent me into a spiral of doubt. He didn't say that everything could be fixed, and I realized that maybe we couldn't go back to the way we were before. I left him without saying a word, but my mind was filled with questions I couldn't ask. Why wasn't he trying to fight for us? Why wasn't he willing to solve this problem? And why, at this moment when I needed to hear his words, was his silence so heavy? For a few days I sat and thought. I tried to figure out if it was worth it to keep fighting, if it was worth fighting for a relationship that no longer felt strong. It was getting harder and harder every day. I realized that maybe I just couldn't continue to live in this relationship where I felt unwanted. I couldn't stay in this relationship if it was starting to fall apart, if every step he took was pushing me further away from him. I decided I needed to make a decision. I didn't want to drag it out. I didn't want to stay in a relationship that was hurting me. But at the same time, I wasn't ready to give up on everything that was between us. This battle between wanting to stay and feeling like I deserved more kept going on in my head, but I knew there had to be something that could help me sort it out. And so, at that moment, when I realized that I needed to step aside and start letting go, I felt ready for the next step. But one question remained: could I learn to let him go if he was never ready to let go of his motorcycle, but not me? 3 days had passed since I had made my decision, and I still felt the weight of this question weighing on me. We hadn't seen each other, and he hadn't tried to contact me. He was still in his world, and I was left here with thoughts that wouldn't let me rest. These days dragged on like an eternity. On one level, I had already decided that I needed to move on, but at the same time, I still couldn't let go of the moments that connected me to him. Every time I passed his messages, my fingers twitched to open them, but I stopped every time. I couldn't read his words because they weren't what I wanted to hear. There was no apology, no explanation, just an emptiness that made me question our future. I decided I couldn't stay in this limbo any longer. I sat on the couch, looking out the window, wondering how this had all happened. We were close, weren't we? I thought we understood each other. We laughed together, dreamed about the future, talked about what we would do in the years to come. But now it all seemed distant and alien. It became obvious to me that despite all the things we had in common, his priorities had changed. The motorcycle had become more important than me, and he made this decision not with words, but with silence. That day, sitting at home, I realized that I couldn't continue to live in this relationship. I couldn't afford to be with someone who didn't value me, not after he had so easily replaced me with something more interesting, something that didn't require his effort, didn't ask for his attention. I didn't have to wait to realize that this wasn't for me. I couldn't be the one to tolerate neglect. My time was no less valuable than his. After all this, I needed to meet him to finally understand the situation. I was going to meet him to understand once and for all what to do next. I searched for words that could express everything that had accumulated inside me. But the more I tried to imagine this conversation, the less certainty remained. I did not know how to tell him that I could not be with him anymore, that I was no longer satisfied with his attitude. All I felt was disappointment. That evening, when I finally decided to write to him, I saw the emptiness in my messages again. He didn't answer. And at that moment, I felt like I had already done everything I could to fix this. I couldn't wait any longer for him to suddenly change. There was no point in continuing to try to draw out something that no longer brought satisfaction. I typed and sent him a message telling him that we needed to talk, that I couldn't stay in this relationship anymore. The relief I felt when I sent that message was intense and unexpected. Even though I knew it would be hard, that breaking up is never easy, I felt like I had done the right thing. I had finally accepted that I couldn't live in a relationship that hurt me. A couple of hours later, he responded. His message lacked the sincerity I expected. There was no admission of his mistakes. He simply wrote that he understood everything, that he respected my choice. It was an empty phrase carrying no weight. I felt his words had no weight. He was not ready to fight for us, and this finally confirmed my decision. Within a few days, I felt a lot of things begin to change. I began to focus on myself again, on my interests. I began to understand that life without him was not the end, but the beginning of a new path. On the outside, everything remained the same, my home, my habits, my friends, but inside, things began to change. I was freed from what was weighing me down. I felt the release fill me with strength, and despite the pain, I knew I had made the right move. I was learning to let go. It wasn't easy. Not every day was full of joy, and sometimes I thought again about what could have been if he had done something differently. But eventually I realized that the feelings I was experiencing no longer brought me happiness. I deserve a relationship in which I am valued and respected. The journey to self-worth was difficult, but I started it. Every day when I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw the girl waiting for a call or an excuse. I saw a woman ready to love and respect herself. This was more than just the end of a relationship. This was a step toward a better version of myself. A few weeks had passed since the day I finally decided to break up. At first, it was hard to get used to the silence in my life. I no longer called him, didn't wait for his messages, didn't check my phone in the hope that he would finally write. But every day, every morning when I woke up, I felt how my life was gradually starting to change. I still remembered the moments when we were together, and all those dreams that I once built about our future. But they were becoming more and more foggy, like him himself, the person who was once an important part of my life, but now became just a part of the past. I noticed how my thoughts had changed. All this time I had been trying to figure out what was wrong with us, what had gone wrong with me. But now I realized that all this time the problem was not only with him. I had allowed myself to be so consumed by the relationship that I had lost my identity, my own interests, and desires. It was not his choice, but mine. And I finally came to the realization that with each day spent with him, I became less of myself. Now I had a new choice. I had to rediscover the world that was out there, beyond our meetings and conversations. I returned to my old passions, to the hobbies that had once filled me with joy. I began to spend more time with friends, to go to yoga classes and walks in the park. I remembered how much I enjoyed reading books that I had abandoned, and how long it had been since I wrote in my journal. These small joys began to fill me, and with each passing day I felt my self-confidence returning. There were moments of weakness though. I would sometimes catch myself thinking about him. Sometimes I would remember how his laughter would fill the room, how we would laugh at the same jokes, how close and trusting we were. But every time these thoughts would arise, I would try to remind myself that this was not the person I wanted to be with. I didn't want to go back to a relationship where I felt invisible, where my needs and desires didn't matter. One evening, sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea, I realized that I no longer felt angry, but simply calm. This period of separation was painful, but at the same time it gave me a chance to learn to be myself. It was a time to let go of old attachments and fears that kept me in this relationship. I was no longer afraid of loneliness, because I began to enjoy my own company. My thoughts went back to the first time I met him. I remembered how he looked, how his gaze made me feel special. I thought he would be the person I would spend my life with. But now I realized that it was nothing more than an illusion that was shattered as soon as I began to see things as they really are. I thought about what I wanted for myself in the future. I wanted to be with someone who appreciated me, who wouldn't leave me for something more exciting. I wanted to be with someone who was willing to put in the effort so we could grow together, not push us apart. That was my lesson. I had to put my needs and wants first and not settle for less. I deserved respect and love, and I would wait for someone who could give it to me. One evening, a few weeks later, I received a text from him. He wrote, "How are you?" I read it, and the first thing I felt was emptiness. There was no pain, no joy, just a slight confusion. He wanted to give back what we had lost again, but I already knew that I didn't want to go back to what had destroyed us. I didn't answer him, and I no longer felt the need to explain my feelings. He had to understand that I had made my choice. After I didn't respond to his message, I realized that it was final closure. I felt free. I was no longer dependent on his opinion. his behavior, his decision. I was able to control my life and go in the direction I chose for myself. Now a new world was opening up to me. I was starting to rebuild my life. I didn't know what I would do in the future, but I was sure that I would never again allow myself to be in a relationship that made me feel worthless. I knew there would be difficult moments and moments of doubt ahead, but I was ready to go through them. I found myself again, and that was more important than any relationship. I stood on the threshold of a new life, ready to accept everything that it would offer me, and, most importantly, I knew that now I would value myself. A few weeks passed, and I began to get used to my new life. My days were no longer filled with waiting for his texts, no more evenings spent on the phone, worried that he wasn't answering or canceling plans. The emptiness that had once seemed unbearable to me now became something natural, and I realized that I could enjoy the silence. I began to see it as space for myself. I began to notice how my relationships with my friends were changing. With them, I didn't have to hide my feelings or justify my actions. I could be myself, without fear of being misunderstood or judged. They supported me without questioning what had happened, and I valued them even more than before. When you're going through something painful, true friends are the ones who help you recover, and they, more than anyone, understand that it's not words that matter, but actions. But sometimes, when night fell, the loneliness would fall upon me again. I would lie down in bed and feel how this silence became unusual. In these moments, I often caught myself thinking that it would be nice to just hear his voice, to ask how he was doing. These were small weaknesses, moments when I forgot why I took this step. But then I began to understand that the world we were building was full of unnecessary things. My view of relationships changed. I started thinking about what it meant to me to be in a relationship. All this time I tried to justify his actions, tried to find reasons for his behavior, hoping that he would change. But with each passing day, I realized more and more that in a relationship, it is not only the desire to be together that is important, but also respect, attention, striving for common goals and interests. I always tried to meet his expectations, but I forgot about my own needs. I started to devote more time to myself. Before, I didn't notice how little time I spent on my own development, on my hobbies. Now I signed up for photography courses, started reading books again that I once adored. Every small victory, every completed chapter of a book or a successful photo gave me confidence. I began to feel like a whole person again. Sometimes I still wanted to go back to what we once had, but I knew it would be a mistake. I told myself more and more often that I needed to be honest with myself. This was my path to inner freedom. With every step, with every choice, I learned to value myself more and more. One of the highlights of this period was my weekend trip to the mountains with friends. It was our plan, a few days in the silence of nature, without the hustle and bustle, without business meetings and constant pressure. We rode bikes, walked along the trails, enjoyed just being together. I noticed how I began to relax, how all those stresses and worries that had accumulated over the past months began to dissolve. This was the moment when I felt my energy returning, how I began to appreciate the world around me again. This weekend was my revelation. I saw that happiness does not depend on someone else. I can be happy without waiting for someone to fill the void that was left by his departure. This empty space was now my chance to change, a chance to create a life in which there would be no room for doubt and dissatisfaction. When I returned home, I felt like I had reached a milestone in my life. My life was in my hands, and I was no longer going to let anyone or anything ruin it. All I needed was to be honest with myself and those around me, to appreciate every moment, every day, and to choose what brings me joy. A few more months passed, and I felt confident in my abilities again. I started a new relationship with myself. I learned to trust myself and build my life the way I want. I realized that a relationship with someone is not a reason to lose yourself, and that being in love is, first of all, loving and respecting yourself. And then one day, on one of my usual morning runs in the park, I met someone new. He wasn't like him. He wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. But most importantly, he respected my boundaries, was sincere, and didn't try to squeeze anything out of me. That was the moment I realized I could start a new relationship, but on a completely different level. I was no longer afraid of what I had lost. I knew that I would now choose people who respected me and my boundaries, and I would be willing to create relationships that would grow and develop with respect and love. I knew that I would no longer lose myself for someone else, and that was exactly what I was looking for. Time passed, and although I felt like I was moving forward, my thoughts wouldn't leave me. At some point, I realized that everything I had been through was actually a lesson for me. A lesson about the importance of respecting your own needs and feelings, and the importance of not letting someone else's actions or deeds determine your worth. I still felt a little pain in my chest when I thought about those days when my expectations of the relationship were shattered. But now the pain was no longer so intense. I understood that it was part of the process, part of my growth, and most importantly, I learned to let go. I learned to forgive not only him, but myself. My world became more full and clear. The time I used to spend waiting and doubting was now filled with action. I threw myself into working to reach new heights and into my personal development. I began planning the trips I had dreamed of, learning new hobbies, and meeting friends I hadn't interacted with before. These were all small but meaningful steps toward regaining control of my life. One day I decided to have a day completely dedicated to myself. No obligations, no plans with friends, No phone calls or texts. I booked a spa treatment, bought tickets to an exhibition I had been wanting to see for a long time, and just enjoyed every minute. It was a day when I felt restored. I learned to appreciate solitude, not to fear it. I realized that, in order to be happy, I don't need to look to other people for validation of my worth. It was at this moment that I met him. He was new to my world, but not new to my views. His calmness and confidence attracted me at first sight. He was not the kind of person who shouted about his superiority. He was not the kind of person who tried to please others. He was real, sincere, and most importantly, he respected me for who I was. With him, there was no room for manipulation or hidden motives. He was simple in his communication, but deep in his actions. Our relationship started smoothly, without pressure. He was not in a hurry, did not try to get my attention right away. We talked, shared thoughts, plans, and most importantly, respected each other's space. We built our communication on trust and respect, and not on expectations and dependencies. We were both ready to work on ourselves and not demand changes from each other. I understood that this was a new stage in my life. I was no longer the same as before. I did not live in anticipation, did not base my value on relationships with other people. I learned to be myself, and perhaps, only now could I truly appreciate what it means to be with someone. I was not looking for the perfect person. I was looking for a partner who could be with me not to fill the void, but to share his happiness. It wasn't what I expected, but maybe it was better. I understood that all the previous relationships and their painful moments were the building blocks that built me as a person. They weren't in vain. Now that I had opened my heart to love again, I could give it not out of fear of losing, but because I was ready to share my life with someone who would be a real partner for me, not an illusion. Life wasn't perfect, and I didn't expect it to be. But I knew one thing: I would no longer let anyone destroy what I was building for myself. I learned to value myself, and that became my foundation. When you start loving yourself, you become stronger. You understand that you don't depend on how others treat you. And because of that, you can choose the people who respect and value you. You stop being afraid of loneliness because you understand that it is not emptiness, but a space for self-expression and growth. My life was now in my hands. I didn't make it dependent on someone's actions or words. I was ready to meet each new day with the confidence that everything that happens is part of my path. And even if something doesn't turn out the way I expected, I now knew how to be strong and move on. I wasn't looking for a perfect relationship. I was looking for a real one, and that started with self-love and self-respect. A few more months passed, and I began to realize how deeply my relationship with myself and the world around me had changed. If before I was afraid of loneliness and tried to fill it with any relationship just to avoid being alone with myself, now everything was different. I learned to be alone and no longer perceived loneliness as the absence of something important, as an emptiness that urgently needed to be filled with something. On the contrary, this space turned out to be valuable to me. It became a place where I could truly listen to myself, make important decisions, and make a choice in favor of my own well-being. All this time, despite the loneliness I developed, I delved into my hobbies and interests and worked on personal growth. Photography, which I began to study, became not just a hobby, but a real passion. I learned to see the world in a new way, to appreciate every moment, and to catch those unique moments that had previously escaped my attention. Each frame became not just an image for me, but a story that I could tell others. It was my creative space, a place where I could be myself and express my emotions through the camera lens. I also started doing yoga and meditation, which turned out to be not only a physical practice, but also a way to clear my mind and connect with my feelings. These practices allowed me to learn to control my emotions and respond to stressful situations with a clear head. They helped me stay in the present moment without dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. I wouldn't say it was easy. There were moments when old memories, feelings, and unconscious expectations would come over me, but I learned to let go. I realized that every time I stop myself from old patterns of behavior, when I choose calmness over worries, I strengthen my connection with myself. I began to understand that these are not just worries, but stages that I must go through to become a more mature and confident woman. Sometimes I wanted to go back to the old days, to that person who was once part of my life. Sometimes, when I heard his name or saw his photo on social media, something inside me would clench and I would think how great it would be to go back. But I knew better. It was my choice to move forward and not cling to something that no longer brought me joy. I no longer sought solace in the past because I realized that my life is not just a chain of events, but a process in which I create my own future. I started thinking about what it meant to be in a relationship with someone before I jumped into another relationship again. I realized that I had to be ready for it. I wasn't looking for someone to simply replace the void that had been in my life before. I was looking for someone I could be with, support each other, and not try to fill a vacuum. One day, while walking in the park, I met him. I wouldn't say it was love at first sight, but something about him attracted me. He wasn't perfect, but there was something special in his eyes that made me think that I was ready to open my heart to him. We started talking slowly. I remembered how important it was to take it slow, not to rush into things like I used to. We met, talked about life, shared our thoughts and dreams. He was sincere and honest, and that immediately attracted me. In the first weeks of our relationship, I didn't immediately try to build a future. I didn't have the same expectations for him that I had for my last partner. I knew it was important to be honest with myself and with him. I knew that this time, I wanted to build a relationship based on respect and mutual support, not on a need for comfort or validation. Every day I felt like I was discovering new horizons. He wasn't the kind of person who promised the impossible. Instead, he showed his care through simple but meaningful actions. We spent time together, but we also respected each other's space. We didn't rush, we didn't try to impose our goals and desires on each other. We built a relationship based on trust and mutual understanding. I began to realize that the relationship I was looking for was not an ideal, but a reality based on honesty and respect. It was not love at first sight, but rather a deep understanding that we were both ready to build something real, without illusions and expectations, without pressure and fear. I stopped being afraid of being abandoned or disappointed. I learned to be independent, and that gave me the strength to be in a relationship without losing myself. I understood that I can't change myself for someone to love me, and that true love only comes when you accept yourself for who you are, rather than trying to be someone else to please someone else. And perhaps it was because of this that I was able to build a healthy relationship in which there was no fear, no expectations, and no manipulation. We were partners, not each other's saviors, and that was true happiness. We learned to love each other as we are, and most importantly, to respect personal boundaries and desires. I don't know what the future will bring, but I'm not afraid of it anymore. Now, I know that I can be happy no matter who I'm with. I realize that only when you learn to love yourself, you can truly open up to another person and build something real with them. And if it's a real, sincere person who respects you, then the relationship will be a joy, not an obligation. Now I can look to the future without fear and doubt, because I know that I don't need to look for happiness in other people or circumstances. It is within me, and only I decide how to find it. Story 3, when I started dating him, I thought I had found the one I would be with forever. We were young, and everything in our world was new and exciting. We met at school, but our relationship grew into something more when I entered university. He was exactly the kind of person I thought was ideal, smart, charismatic, self-confident. Everyone said he was lucky to have me, and I thought I was lucky to have him. I saw care and attention in his eyes, and confidence in his words that I was important to him. At the time, it seemed infinitely beautiful and right. I didn't look for any flaws or reasons to doubt, because at that moment we were one whole story. I remember the first months, everything was so easy, carefree, and perfect. We walked around the city together, watched movies, shared our dreams and plans. I felt comfortable in his company, and I couldn't help but wonder how he could communicate with people so easily, how he could be the center of attention, how everyone around him admired him. It seemed part of his charm, and I was proud to be around him. He was charismatic, and everyone trusted him. But with each passing day, I began to feel that something was wrong. These little moments that at first seemed insignificant began to acquire great significance. Even at the beginning of the relationship, I noticed that he had a strange interest in other women. I'm not talking about simply judging someone's appearance. Everyone does that. But when he looked at them, his gaze became somehow too long, too insistent, as if he was involuntarily trying to compare them with you. I didn't like it, but I tried to close my eyes to it. It's normal. He doesn't want to offend me, I thought, convincing myself that such trifles cannot ruin a relationship. But over time, such moments began to repeat themselves more and more often. He could look at girls in a cafe or on the street for a long time, and I, noticing this, tried not to react, as if it was all not so important. I always told myself that there was no need to dwell on such trifles, that he was next to me, he loved me, and that was the main thing. But something inside me began to change. An unclear anxiety that I could not explain did not allow me to feel calm. I continued to be with him, despite these strange moments, and convinced myself that everything was fine. Then there came a point when he started making scenes, accusing me of looking at other guys. It was something strange. He, who himself could not help but look at other women, suddenly began to suspect me of doing the same. I remember how one day, after a walk, he angrily said that he noticed how I looked at another man and that it offended him. I tried to explain to him that it was an accidental glance, that I was not thinking about him at all, but his face became more and more serious, and he continued to accuse me of something I did not do. He said that he could not understand how I could be with him if I did not care. I didn't understand why these scenes started happening. He was the same person who always remained confident and calm, and now his behavior was becoming more and more strange. I felt bad that he didn't trust me, that he thought I could cheat on him, and it only got worse with each passing time. His suspicions and paranoid behavior began to eat away at my calm and confidence in the relationship. I wondered more and more why I should be the one to blame, why my actions and intentions were always in question. Every time he made these scenes, I felt more and more helpless. I tried to justify myself, but it didn't change anything. He became more and more insecure, and I lost more and more of my freedom and confidence that everything would be fine between us. Deep down, I felt that he was starting to destroy what we had built, but I didn't know how to stop this process. I tried to believe in his words, his promises, But with each new argument, I doubted more and more that our relationship could be the same as it was at the very beginning. Was it just my perception, or was he really changing? And why did I start noticing all these little things that would have seemed so insignificant before? Every time I tried to talk to him, he would steer the conversation in another direction, accusing me of being overly suspicious or overly sensitive. I tried to figure out what was going on with him more and more often, but he always found a way to turn everything against me, even when I had done nothing wrong. Maybe I just didn't notice all these signs at the beginning of the relationship. Maybe I shouldn't have turned a blind eye to his strange behavior, to his constant dependence on how others perceive him. These questions were spinning in my head, but I couldn't find the answers. I felt that he was changing, but I couldn't figure out what exactly the problem was. And at that moment, it became clear to me that I had to do something, that our relationship couldn't be like before. But what exactly did I need to do? How to stop this destruction that was mercilessly approaching if I couldn't even name its exact cause? I didn't know then that this moment would be just the beginning of a long journey. A journey on which I would seek answers to all these questions, and also learn to live with the consequences of my choices. But at that moment, I couldn't think about it. I just wanted to understand why everything had become like this. Every day I felt more and more how his behavior was starting to break me. He was such a seemingly perfect person in the eyes of others, and I increasingly doubted that we were even in the same reality. At first, these were small things, almost unnoticeable, but each time I realized more and more clearly that his behavior was not just strange, it contradicted the very foundations of a healthy relationship. When we started hanging out, he seemed to ignore me if there was an attractive girl around. I could be there, but his gaze was always on others. It irritated me, but I tried to calm down again. He didn't want to offend me. He probably just didn't think about how his behavior could hurt me. And then, when I started looking at someone, he immediately accused me of not respecting him, of cheating on him. He always said that he didn't understand how I could be with him, because I was too good for him. It was like manipulation, his confidence, his self-deprecation, his constant demands on himself. He claimed that I didn't like his appearance, that I was too beautiful for him, but at the same time he always tried to look his best in front of others, and everyone had to admire him. He demanded attention and approval from everyone, but it seemed like there was no place for me in his world. These double standards simply killed me. He could not understand how I could look at others, but at the same time, he seemed to forget that his gaze was not just an accident, it was something more. It became clear to me that he was adjusting his everyday reality to his own standards that were convenient for him, and I was just part of this game when he decided what I needed and what I should avoid. We often walked in a group, and I watched as his friends laughed and joked about his attractiveness or how he attracted attention. He smiled, and his eyes shone with pride, as if this was a confirmation of his importance. I began to notice that the feeling of admiration was important to him, but only from others, and at the same time he was ready to close his eyes to my feelings and emotions. And it wasn't a coincidence. It was his everyday behavior. He demanded attention, care, loyalty, and understanding from me, but at the same time he couldn't show it to me fully. He didn't notice that I also wanted attention, that it was also important for me to feel special for him. He could talk for hours about how important every detail of his appearance was for him, how important it was to be the first, the coolest, and the most attractive. But when it came to my experiences, it was as if he didn't hear. It seemed to me that he lived in his own little world, where everyone was obliged to admire him and support him, and I was increasingly becoming part of the scenery, ignored at the most important moments. I tried to approach him with a conversation, but every time I tried to address his behavior, he would turn it into accusations. "You're too sensitive. You're looking for problems where there aren't any," he would say. And every time I was left with this feeling of helplessness, as if my feelings were something insignificant, as if I wasn't allowed to care about the fact that his behavior hurt me. He would claim that whatever I was going through didn't matter because it was his life, his choice, and I should just accept it. The hardest part was that he would start manipulating my emotions. When I caught him looking at other women, I would feel jealous and worried, but if I decided to talk about it, he would start accusing me of not trusting him. "Why do you think I'm looking at someone? Don't you trust me?" he would say, and every time I tried to explain that the lack of trust had nothing to do with what I was feeling, he would reduce it to my inadequate emotions. This created a vicious cycle where every time I felt hurt, I had to fight to not let him undermine my confidence. The situation with his friend who flirted with me behind his back was not an accident either. I tried to understand why he did not see how this person behaved inappropriately, but he always thought that it was not worth discussing. This friend was constantly violating boundaries, flirting with women, including me, while his relationship with a girl was not something exclusive to him. He did not even hide his interest in me, and every time I tried to convey to the guy that his friend was violating personal boundaries, he reduced it all to my own problem. "You think too much about it. He is just my friend," he said, not attaching importance to how his friend behaved towards me. While I, not wanting to create conflicts, kept silent about my feelings, his friend continued to behave the same way, flirting and joking. As a result, the guy not only did not support me, but also became more and more distant, as if it was my fault that his friend was violating boundaries. I was beginning to see more and more clearly that our interactions with him were more like manipulation than a relationship. I was becoming nothing more than a tool for his satisfaction, and this was depressing me. I tried to guess his expectations, adjust to his moods, and always be perfect, but in return he gave me nothing in return. More and more I felt like a prisoner of his expectations, where my every move was assessed and judged. With each passing day, it became more and more difficult for me to justify my place next to him, because I felt that my personal significance was becoming less and less obvious to him. His behavior wasn't just a mistake or an unconscious act. It was part of his thinking, his perception of the world, where everyone had to adapt to him, and only he remained untouched. Every day I lost a part of myself trying to live up to these standards, but deep down I knew that all these double standards, hypocrisy and manipulation could not continue. At some point, I began to notice that our connection was no longer what it used to be. Instead of growing stronger and more mutual, as our relationship promised, I felt myself drifting further and further away from him. And it wasn't just physical distance. I felt as if something important and elusive was crumbling inside. His words, his actions, his behavior were becoming more and more distant, while I, on the contrary, was sinking deeper into my own experiences. I felt his indifference beginning to penetrate my consciousness, leaving me with the thought that I was losing myself in the process. I couldn't figure out when it all started. When did his kindness and concern for my feelings become just empty words? When did he start to stop noticing my experiences, my needs, my desires? When did he turn into this person who was increasingly raising his ego, but remained empty inside, not wanting to give anything in return? These questions were spinning restlessly in my head, but I couldn't find the answer. At some point, I just felt that I was no longer important to him. He was always very good at appearing attentive and caring. He would say the right words, make the right gestures, but in essence his attention was always superficial. I noticed that in moments when I was really struggling, he increasingly found excuses not to engage in conversations. He still demanded attention from me, but he himself only gave it when the situation demanded it, when he needed something from me. But when I needed support, he could be elusive and distracted. He never took my problems seriously, as if they were not important enough to discuss. Sometimes when I tried to talk to him about what was bothering me, he would simply tell me that I expected too much. He would say that I was too sensitive, that such little things were not worth worrying about. But these were not just little things. I felt like he didn't notice me. Every worry or concern I had was dismissed by him, turning it all into my unnecessary emotions. I could no longer understand why I continued to endure this. He often said he loved me, but his actions did not back up his words. He was there, but only physically. I increasingly felt that I was alone on an emotional level. He did not support me when I needed it. He did not value my feelings when I opened up to him. He was not my partner in the true sense of the word, but rather a passerby in my life who stopped to look at me less and less often. Increasingly, I felt like I did not belong to him, and he did not belong to me. His attention became rare, like rain in an arid desert, and when it did appear, it seemed like a strange act of goodwill, rather than a manifestation of genuine interest in me. He didn't share my emotions, he didn't care about me. When I was upset, he would tell me to just calm down. When I was stressed about something important, he would tell me it wasn't worth wasting my energy on. I felt like an empty vessel that he never invested anything real into. His care was shallow, empty, and useless. I began to realize that not only did he not share my emotions, he didn't care about them. He became incapable of understanding what was important to me, and it was unbearable. It took me a long time to figure out what exactly was wrong with him. It wasn't just a normal argument or a misunderstanding. He had become unavailable to me. Not physically, I saw him every day, but emotionally. It was like looking at someone through glass. I tried to communicate with him, tried to open up to him about my feelings, but every time he brushed my words aside as if they were insignificant. I was scared to realize that I couldn't trust him anymore, that he no longer listened to me and didn't understand me. I began to feel him change. He became more closed, more distant. His world intersected less and less with mine. He didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't inquire about my day. He stopped noticing my worries. Instead, I became the source of his discontent. He began to accuse me of not trying, of not being attentive, of being too demanding. But it wasn't true. I tried, I wanted to be close to him. I wanted to maintain our contact, but he was pulling away. I felt increasingly alone, and this loneliness had nothing to do with the fact that I was physically alone. I was next to him, but there was no room for me in his world. I was like an invisible person who couldn't find my place in his life. All he did was take care of himself. He was focused on getting attention from others, not from me. Everything I did was unimportant. Everything I experienced was unimportant. I started to wonder how long I could continue in this state. Could I tolerate all this? Could I continue to be in this relationship that was hurting and alienating me? After all, I was losing myself more and more in it, trying to please him and justify his actions. I was increasingly realizing that I couldn't live with a person who didn't see me and didn't appreciate my feelings. And at some point, I realized that maybe it was time to end it. The one I loved had become a stranger to me. With each passing day, I felt the trust between us crumbling like old, cracked glass. It wasn't a sudden realization, a moment when everything suddenly became clear, but a gradual process that I couldn't stop. I began to realize that those moments when we talked about our feelings, when we tried to be honest with each other, were a thing of the past. It was hard and painful, but I couldn't be blind anymore. We always talked about honesty being important in a relationship. We said that we would always be open with each other, that we could talk about everything without fear of being judged or misunderstood. But gradually I began to notice that his words and actions contradicted this idea. He began to hide his actions, and every time I tried to figure out what was going on, he would tell me that it didn't matter or that I was just being too picky. I tried to ignore it, but it was getting harder each time. There were no obvious betrayals, no open infidelities. Everything was much more complicated. Everything was in the details: his silence, his withdrawal into himself, his answers to my questions, which became more and more evasive. He no longer told me about what was happening in his life, about his experiences and thoughts. His behavior became closed, and I began to feel that in fact he had long since retreated into his own shell, from which he could not emerge. More and more often I felt how the sincerity that was in our relationship when we first started dating was slipping away from him. But the most painful thing was that his secrecy began to extend to everything. When I tried to find out what was going on, he often told me that nothing important. But I knew that was not true. I knew that he could not be so closed, that he could not help but share with me what was really important to him. But he continued to hide everything that could bother me. When his behavior began to violate my internal boundaries, I began to feel that trust was disappearing. It was like a disappointment, like an empty space that filled everything around. His words no longer had the meaning they used to have. I stopped believing his promises. I stopped trusting his actions, because every time I hoped that something would change, everything remained the same. He told me that everything would be fine, that we would overcome any problems. But in reality, I saw that he did not change. I kept seeing his actions that told me that he was not ready to be honest, not ready to open up to me. Inside, I felt how my feelings were gradually breaking, how the threads of connection between us were breaking one by one. It began to hurt me to realize that I could no longer trust his words. Every promise he made began to lose its value because I knew they were not backed up by actions. He told me everything would be okay, but I felt it wasn't. He told me I should trust him, but his behavior was the complete opposite of what he claimed. The problem was that I couldn't figure out when exactly the trust started to fade. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process. It was a series of small actions, seemingly insignificant moments that gradually added up to a bigger picture. And the more I tried to figure out what was happening, the clearer it became that our connection wasn't what it used to be. He was there, but I couldn't feel that he was real. He was there, but at the same time, it was like he wasn't there. My feelings and experiences were beyond his perception. I tried to figure out what to do. I tried to find a way to connect, to restore the sincerity we once had. But it was getting harder and harder. I realized that trust can't be restored. It's either there or it's not. And if it's gone, then part of what was between us disappears with it. I couldn't get him to open up. I couldn't get him to be honest. He wasn't ready to take that step. And I began to realize that maybe I wasn't ready to live in a relationship where there was no trust either. This realization came to me slowly but surely. I began to doubt whether I had ever been truly happy in this relationship. I doubted. Everything I had experienced was connected to his secrecy, his indifference. I could no longer continue to hope that something would change. He was not ready to be honest and open, and I could not be with a man who did not respect my feelings, who was not ready to share his life and his truth with me. And then I realized that if I stayed in this relationship, I would lose myself. I would continue to struggle with my own experiences, swallow the bitterness of his indifference, but in the end I would be alone, even if he was there. Because trust, like love, cannot be restored if it is broken, and perhaps I was already too tired to wait for him to finally open his soul to me. It was hard for me to admit it to myself, but there came a point when I realized I couldn't continue in this relationship. It wasn't because I didn't love him or care about him. On the contrary, I still felt affection for him, but something had changed inside me. Something important had broken, and I couldn't ignore it. I could no longer turn a blind eye to the way he ignored my feelings, the way his behavior was destroying our trust. I began to feel like I was losing myself, and it was unbearable. Every day I realized more and more clearly that I could not continue living with a person who was not ready to change, who could not respect my boundaries and feelings. I could not be in a relationship where all my experiences were ignored, where my feelings became insignificant and unimportant. He continued to play his role, trying to seem perfect in front of others, but inside our world there was no place for me. I could not be near him anymore. I could not maintain this false harmony that smelled of emptiness. Everything he did was aimed at keeping me close, but his actions told me that I was unimportant, that my emotions were just something unnecessary and unnecessary. And at some point I realized that if I didn't take a step forward, if I didn't understand what I needed, I would continue to get stuck in this swamp. I didn't want to be just a part of his life, without any meaning of its own. I didn't want to be the one who would tolerate his indifference and disrespect. I couldn't remain silent any longer and just follow him, expecting him to change someday. My friends and family had noticed something was wrong for a long time. They saw me changing, becoming more and more withdrawn, my emotions losing their power. I stopped laughing the way I used to. I stopped being the one who enjoyed life. All of this was poisoning my soul, and I couldn't stay in this relationship unless I was willing to lose my identity. I tried to talk to him. I wanted to tell him that I couldn't be with him anymore unless he changed. But as soon as I started expressing my feelings, he closed up again. He couldn't understand why I was upset. He didn't want to see that his actions and words were hurting me. He kept defending himself and accusing me of demanding too much. And that was the last straw. I couldn't wait any longer, hoping that he would change. I realized that the decision had to be mine. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to get out of this relationship when I had invested so much into it. 6 years is a long time, and it wasn't easy. But I knew that if I continued, I would lose myself more and more. I would continue to swallow my pain and regret not being myself. I couldn't let him rule my life anymore. It wasn't just a matter of love. It was a matter of respect and inner harmony. Then I decided that I needed to change something, and I started making a plan. First, I started working on myself. I stopped blaming myself for how I felt. I realized that I didn't have to be perfect for him, that I had the right to my feelings and experiences. I started to restore my inner peace and regain the confidence that had been lost. I couldn't allow myself to get lost in his world, in his manipulations and claims. I had to find my own way. I started asking questions I had been avoiding. Why did I allow myself to be in a relationship that hurt me? Why did I allow him to be the way he was? Why didn't I put my needs first? I tried to be honest with myself and realized that I deserve better. I deserve respect, love, care. I shouldn't be the one putting up with behavior that destroys me. Slowly, I began to realize that leaving that relationship wasn't a betrayal. It was to rebuild my life, to be a whole person again. I shouldn't have stayed in that relationship just because it was part of my past. I realized that I deserved better. I deserved to be with someone who valued me, who respected my boundaries and feelings, and if he didn't have that, I had to let him go. There came a point where I knew I couldn't continue being with him. I knew he wouldn't change, his behavior wouldn't change, and I couldn't wait my whole life for him to finally realize I deserved more. I took a step forward, deciding to leave him, even if it meant going through pain. But I knew I had to take care of myself. I had to get my inner strength and confidence back. I walked away, and though it hurt, I felt relief. It was the beginning of a new journey, a journey where I would learn to be myself again, where I would work to find harmony within myself. I knew I deserved better, and I was no longer going to put up with what was destroying me. And though the road ahead was full of questions and uncertainty, I was ready to move forward, free of what was weighing me down. After I made the decision to end the relationship, my life began to change. The moment I closed the door behind me, the feeling of freedom was mixed with a feeling of emptiness. It seemed that the world no longer had those familiar forms, those landmarks that I was so accustomed to. Everything around me became different. Everything was alien and unfamiliar. It was scary, but at the same time I felt as if my inner world was beginning to clear. It may sound strange, but at first I even found being alone calming. Everything around me was new. I was myself, and it was like coming home. It was my own life, and now I could do whatever I wanted with it. I began to realize that the pain, the emptiness I felt in the first days was the result of finally breaking away from what was dragging me down. But it wasn't emptiness in the sense that I was left without anything. On the contrary, I felt free. I realized that I could rebuild my identity, not depend on other people's expectations and disappointments. Being alone, I started to think a lot. And first of all, I started to think about who I really am. We often lose ourselves in relationships, dissolving in the other person, trying to please, trying to understand them, trying to fix them. But I understood that in order to move forward, I needed to understand myself first. What were my dreams and goals? What do I really want from my life? And most importantly, who am I without him? Everything I did before was kind of about us. I stopped thinking about my own desires because happiness was what mattered to me. I sacrificed my own interests so that he could feel comfortable and confident. I didn't notice how I was losing my own in the process. And now that I was alone, I could finally get back to myself. I started doing things I had been putting off for a long time. I read books that had been lying on the shelf for a long time, but I hadn't had time for. I started taking care of myself, my body, and I started trying new hobbies. I visited places that had previously seemed too boring or inappropriate for our joint outings. I started walking alone and enjoying it. I learned to be in silence, to be at peace with myself. And gradually I began to understand that loneliness does not mean emptiness. It was an opportunity to find inner peace, and I felt parts of my personality that I had long forgotten begin to blossom. I began to realize that my inner fears and doubts weren't so terrible. Loneliness wasn't a punishment, a betrayal, or the end. It was simply a state that allowed me to see things I hadn't noticed before. I stopped thinking that I needed someone to feel complete. I realized that I could be happy and independent, not dependent on what was happening in someone else's life. I started working on myself, and it was liberating. I began to take better care of my physical and emotional well-being. I started exercising, and I loved the feeling of my body getting stronger. I started meditating to clear my head and learn to manage my emotions. I also learned to forgive myself for allowing myself to stay in a destructive relationship for so long. I realized it was my choice, but I no longer wanted to choose someone else's comfort at the expense of my own. Every morning when I woke up, I no longer felt the heaviness in my soul that I used to. I could calmly look in the mirror and smile. It was a return to myself, a return to what I had lost. And it was an amazing feeling. I didn't have to wear a mask to be loved or needed. I no longer sought confirmation of my worth in the eyes of others. I was learning to be the best version of myself for myself, but it wasn't an instantaneous process. Loneliness still washed over me in waves and I felt vulnerable. There were moments when I wanted to go back to that comfortable, familiar world, even if it was full of deception and disrespect. But I knew I couldn't. I couldn't go back to what was destroying me, even if that world had once brought me illusory happiness. I began to understand that it's not so much about not feeling lonely, but how you learn to live with it, how you process the experience and make it part of your growth. The recovery process was long, and I can't say that I'm completely healed. It was something that happened gradually. I learned to let go of old grievances, old pains. I learned to forgive and move forward. I learned to value my feelings and my experiences. I learned not to be afraid to be myself. My friends noticed the changes, and I was proud of myself. I became more confident, more open. I started to rebuild my life. And although I was not ready for a new relationship yet, I understood that when I met a person who was worth my time and attention, I would be ready. I began to value my independence and learn to be a full-fledged person, not a half. And at that moment, I realized that the most important love is the love for yourself. Over time, I began to realize that my life alone was not just a necessity, but a real purification. I did not know what would happen next, but I felt that in this state I could grow and develop as never before. And although the path to self-awareness was not easy, I felt how the inner space was gradually filled with something new, not the old dependence on another person, not illusions, but real strength and confidence. I felt like I was on my way to a whole new stage in my life. Every day brought something important. I could be my true self without fear of anyone judging my decisions, my views, my desires. All that mattered was my own feelings, my own beliefs. I stopped worrying about what someone else would think. I realized that I didn't have to live up to someone else's standards of happiness. I had to be honest with myself, and that opened the door to true freedom. The process of recovery and self-discovery was not easy. There were times when I felt vulnerable and empty, especially when I wanted to share something important with someone. When I wanted to share joy or grief, there was no one there to understand me the way I used to. But I learned to look at these moments not as a loss, but as a chance to learn how to live in complete solitude. I understood that this time was not a punishment, but an opportunity to understand myself more deeply and become stronger. I did not look for someone to fill the void, but rather looked for a way to fill this void myself. And so, on one of those evenings when I stood in front of the mirror again, I realized that I no longer felt the pain that had haunted me before. I am not afraid of loneliness. I am not afraid to be alone. It is not fear, but self-respect. I began to see before me not a weak, independent woman who once tried to cling to a relationship so as not to feel insignificant. Now I saw a strong personality capable of coping with any difficulties. I was ready for new meetings and new experiences, but without the fear of not being accepted, without the fear of finding myself again in a relationship that deprives me of freedom. At some point, I realized that of all the lessons I had learned from my previous relationships, the most important one was that I had to stay true to myself. In the past, I had tried to please, tried to guess what the other person needed, tried to be perfect. But now I realized that my value did not depend on how others saw me. I began to accept my weaknesses, my flaws, and my mistakes. I realized that all of these things make me unique, and they should not stop me. I was ready to let go of the past, even if it was still part of my story, but I was no longer going to let it define my future. I started meeting new people, communicating with those who were close to me, who supported me. It was not a relationship like before, but it was valuable. I began to value my relationships, building them on respect, honesty, and understanding. I stopped being afraid that I needed to look for my value in the eyes of other people. I realized that the most important thing is to be honest and open, to be ready to receive love, but also to give it only in those relationships that do not require sacrifice from me. I often realized that my past relationships, despite all the pain, were an important stage in my growth. I could not have become who I am today if I had not gone through them. They taught me a lot: to be strong, to be independent, to be honest with myself. And although the pain from the breakup was still somewhere deep inside, I no longer looked at it as a tragedy. I looked at it as an experience that shaped me, and that was exactly what I needed to understand. I didn't know what the future would hold. Who knows what the next chapter of my life would bring, but I knew one thing: I would no longer look for my happiness in another person. I would look for it in myself. I would build my life by my own rules, because now I understood that I was responsible for my happiness. As I reflected on how far I had come, I felt proud of myself. I had freed myself from the weight of a relationship that had been crushing me, and I had freed myself from the fear and doubt that had accompanied it. I was now ready for new opportunities, for new relationships, but with the understanding that my inner world was most important. And when I felt this inner peace, I knew that I was ready to meet a new love, one that would be based on mutual respect, on honesty, and on deep understanding. I was no longer looking for the ideal in another person, because I had found the ideal within myself. Story 4. When I met him, I didn't know it would be the beginning of something that would change me forever. He was everything I had ever looked for: smart, confident, with a sharp sense of humor. He was easy to be with, the perfect relationship you could ever dream of. I remember the first time he asked me out on a date. We were walking down the street and I felt so attracted to him. His laugh, His eyes, his gaze that seemed so sincere. I was always afraid of being abandoned or betrayed, but with him, it was different. He talked so much about the importance of honesty and trust that it seemed like nothing could upset our balance. We had been together for a few months now, and I was becoming more and more attached to him with each passing day. He was my first in many ways. My first boyfriend, my first sexual partner. Before him, I had no experience in relationships. I didn't know what it was like to be with someone so close. All I knew were those endless lonely days when I watched other people's couples and dreamed of something like that. When he came into my life, all of those dreams suddenly started coming true. We talked a lot, discussed our views on life, on the future. He said that he wanted to build a serious relationship, that he wanted everything to be honest and open. I liked it. It gave me confidence that I could be myself with him. We did everything together, watched movies, cooked, walked. Sometimes he opened his thoughts to me, told me how important it is to trust another person, to be sincere with them, and I believed him. I didn't know that this trust would soon be called into question. One day he suggested that we be more open with each other. He said that we could exchange passwords for our phones and social networks so that we could trust each other completely. He offered me to look through his phone and I agreed. I thought it was just a gesture of trust, that he had no secrets from me. At that moment, I didn't think that such complete disclosure could cause a whole storm in the future. I remember the day I started looking through his Snapchat. At first, it seemed innocent. I thought it was just a way to get to know him better, to understand what he was really going through before we met. And then, among his old messages, I came across something that changed my perception. It was a video. In it, he was with some girl. They were in bed, and I immediately knew that this was not a casual flirtation. This was something more intimate. My heart sank. I couldn't believe my eyes. This video was recorded 8 months ago, before we started dating. At the time, I had a hard time understanding how it related to our relationship. He was with another woman, and even though it happened before we started dating, I couldn't understand why he hadn't told me about his past. Why did I find out this way? I started to feel like something was wrong. I searched for answers, and more I began to doubt that I could trust him. All this talk about honesty, about trust, seemed like empty words to me. The video felt alien, like I was on the sidelines, watching his past, but not part of his present. I couldn't help but think that if he really wanted to be honest, he would have told me about it sooner, but he didn't, and that silence hurt me. Then, I remembered him saying that almost all of his exes had cheated on him. I didn't understand how that was possible. I couldn't imagine betraying someone you cared about. It was unimaginable to me. And so, I started to think that maybe he had his reasons for hiding things like that. Maybe his past wasn't as bright as he wanted me to think. Maybe he was hiding his mistakes in relationships, from me so that I wouldn't see who he really was. Meanwhile, despite all these doubts, I still loved him. I couldn't just forget what he meant to me. He was the first person I'd ever met who could reach so deeply into my heart. And even though I was worried about his past, I couldn't just let him go. He said he wanted to marry me, that I was important to him, and I believed him. I believed him because I didn't want to believe the worst. But each new discovery shattered my confidence. When I started looking for more on his social media, I found him liking photos of other women. These girls were half naked, sexy. It was weird because I thought that if he was with me, he would respect me. But it turned out that his view of women was not as uniform as I thought. He was liking these photos and I had a hard time understanding how that related to his relationship with me. I tried to reassure myself that it was just social media, that liking photos didn't necessarily mean anything more. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept wondering what his commitment to me really was. He told me that I was the best, that I had no reason to doubt, but I found it increasingly difficult to believe his words when I was faced with this burden of doubt. Every day my feelings became more contradictory. I loved him, but I couldn't understand what was going on in his soul. Why didn't he tell me everything earlier? Why did he continue to do things that hurt me? My inexperience in relationships became my inner enemy. I didn't know what to do with what I had learned, and I couldn't understand why he wouldn't leave me if he wanted other women so much. Why was he still with me if he was so attracted to others? In those moments, I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. On the one hand, I didn't want to lose him, but on the other, it was too painful to think that he was hiding important things from me. All of this left me with feelings that I couldn't fully comprehend. A few days passed, and every moment spent with him became more and more intense for me. Everything I saw wouldn't leave my head. I kept seeing through his eyes how he was with me when we first started dating and how he was now. It seemed like he was still the same person, but now his past stood between us. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. Everything I discovered seemed to become a part of us. Even if I didn't mention it, I didn't know how to deal with it. At first, I tried telling myself that it was okay to be insecure, that I was just too worried that this was before us. He was my first boyfriend after all, and for him, this was all just part of life. But the more I tried to reassure myself, the worse it became. His words about trusting and being open with each other began to sound empty and insincere. He knew I could find these things. He gave me access to everything he had. Why didn't he share them himself? Why did I have to find them this way? All of this became a psychological barrier for me. I couldn't perceive him the same way. He said that he wanted to be with me, that I was important to him. But what if all of this was just words, said so that I wouldn't leave? How can I trust a person who keeps such things a secret? And I felt that it wasn't just doubt, it was fear. Fear that I was making a mistake, that I was trusting a person who could betray me. I tried to talk to him about what was bothering me. That night, as we sat on the couch, I opened my mouth to ask him about the video I'd found. I wanted to understand why he'd never mentioned that he'd been in a relationship with another woman when we first started dating. But whenever I tried to start a conversation, something stopped me. I didn't know how to tell him. I didn't know how to pose the question in a way that would make him understand that it wasn't an accusation, but simply a desire to understand. I was afraid that if I brought it up, I'd lose him. And at some point, I realized that I could not talk about it. I couldn't close my eyes to what I'd seen, but I didn't know how to tell him in a way that wouldn't ruin everything. My doubts began to snowball. I sat there and thought that maybe I should just leave things as they were. Forget about his past, not interfere in his life before me, not search his phone and social media for anything that could hurt me. I tried to convince myself that we were living in the present, that our relationship was what mattered. But every time I looked at his face, I felt like something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something important from me, and that thought sat in my head like a thorn I couldn't pull out. I was losing confidence in myself more and more every day. He was experienced. He knew what he was doing. But what if there was something missing in me? Maybe I wasn't what he expected. Maybe I wasn't good enough. He said I was better than all his exes, that I was the best he'd ever been with. But how could that be true if I had no experience, if I was just learning how to be with him? He'd seen other relationships, other bodies, other souls, and I'd only seen one. And it was depressing. I was afraid he'd feel like there was something missing in our connection, that I couldn't give him what he was looking for. Then I started to wonder if he'd been with other women, if his past was so eventful, and I was just his first real person, then maybe he didn't feel the same way about me that I did about him. Maybe I was just a stopgap for him, not something more meaningful. I wondered how he could be so in love with me when he'd been through so much before me. Why was he still with me when he had so many other options? Every time I tried to talk to him about my feelings, he became closed. I couldn't understand why he didn't want to discuss these things. He said that he loved me, that I was important to him, but the more I tried to understand him, the less I understood. I looked for answers to my questions and my thoughts and what he told me, but they didn't match. He wasn't honest with me, and I found it hard to believe that I could still trust him. I kept thinking that maybe his past didn't matter. He always said that it was before us, that he had changed. But then why couldn't he have told me about it sooner? Why did I have to find these videos and post myself? It was like a knife in the back. I felt like he didn't care about my feelings because he wasn't opening up to me. And the more I tried to understand his past, the more I realized that I didn't have enough information to understand who he really was. I was afraid that my doubts and mistrust would ruin our relationship. I didn't want to lose him, but I couldn't accept that his past was casting a shadow on our future. I felt more and more that I couldn't be with a man who hid such important things from me, who didn't give me the opportunity to understand him fully. In those moments, I realized that I couldn't just let things slide. I couldn't keep lying to myself that everything was okay, that I wasn't worried about what I'd learned. I needed to understand what was happening and take a step forward, but I didn't know what that step would mean for me and for us. Every day I felt how hard it was to be in this relationship. I tried to convince myself that I had to continue, that everything I had learned didn't matter, that the main thing was that he loved me and wanted to be with me. But the more I thought about our past, the more I realized that I couldn't get rid of my doubts and pain. Every time I saw him, I tried not to think about what he hadn't told me. I tried to ignore the images that wouldn't leave my head, his videos with another girl, his likes on photos of half-naked women on social media. All these things he had left behind in his past, like shadows, continued to haunt me, and I didn't know what to do with them. He told me that all of this had happened before us, that he was a different person, but how could I believe that when everything I saw screamed at me that his past couldn't be forgotten so easily? I began to feel that there was no longer the ease between us that had been there in the beginning. Everything had become heavy. He looked at me the same way, but I felt that something had changed between us. He still talked about love, about the future, but I couldn't shake the thought that his feelings might not be as deep as mine. How was it possible that he had been with so many different women and I was just his first experience? It all seemed too complicated to ignore. There was a feeling inside me that I wasn't good enough for him. He was experienced, he knew what he was doing, and I was so inexperienced, even in the simplest things. It seemed to me that he had already been through everything there was to be in a relationship, and none of it was that important to him. He loved me, but could he love me as much as I loved him? He said that I was the best, that he had never met anyone who was so important to him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all just words. I was his first, but he was far from my first. His past was so rich, and I was just a part of his life, one of many. My inexperience was starting to get in the way. I couldn't help but think about how he'd been with other women, how his body, his experiences, his desires were tied to them. I couldn't shake the feeling that in his eyes I was just another phase, not something that mattered. He'd tell me how things had changed since we'd started dating, but what if that was just him trying to keep me around? What if I was just a convenient option for him, someone to be with in the moment, but not someone he wanted to spend his life with? I couldn't stop asking myself these questions, and these questions haunted me. I tried to figure out what to do. How could I live with this doubt if on the one hand he kept talking about love, and on the other, he kept hiding things from me. I couldn't help but think that maybe he wasn't just hiding details but was deliberately hiding part of his present. All of this put me in a difficult position. I loved him, but I couldn't accept that he continued to live in his past without revealing it to me. And then I decided that I needed to talk to him. I couldn't continue to live with this burden, not knowing what was really going on. But as always, when I started thinking about it, I was overcome with fear. I was afraid that if I opened up about it, he would start to defend himself, that the conversation would end in arguments, and we would ruin what we had. But at the same time, I understood that if I didn't talk to him, it would only make my feelings worse. I couldn't live in this swamp of doubt, not knowing what would happen next. I decided that I was going to be honest with him. I had to let him know that I was hurt, that I couldn't continue to turn a blind eye to his past, that I couldn't continue to live in this relationship if I couldn't understand him 100%. I had to understand that it wasn't just about forgiving him for his mistakes, but about understanding how he saw us and how he treated me. I couldn't continue to be with a man who hid things like that from me. I couldn't ignore my feelings. Every time I started thinking about talking, I felt scared. I didn't know how this would affect us, our relationship. He was so important to me, but I couldn't continue to tolerate this feeling of betrayal. I was afraid that if I told him that I was hurt, he would leave. But I also understood that if I remained silent, I would destroy myself from the inside. I couldn't live with this burden of doubts anymore. At some point, I realized that it wasn't just a question of trust. It was a question of how I saw myself in this relationship. I couldn't afford to be with someone who kept hiding things like that from me. I deserved to be with someone who would be honest with me, who wouldn't hide his past, who would be willing to talk about what was important to him. I couldn't continue to build a relationship based on a false idea of who he really was. And even though I still loved him, I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't continue in this relationship if I couldn't find out what was really going on in his life, in his heart. I decided that I would talk to him, even if it was scary, even if it changed everything I knew about us. I had to get answers to understand what was coming next. I couldn't live in this doubt. There was no point in putting this conversation off any longer. I knew that my doubts would only grow until I talked to him. Thoughts raced through my head about how I should start this, what to say so as not to hurt him, but also not to hide my feelings. I felt like I was standing on the edge of an abyss. I was afraid that this conversation would put an end to our relationship, but I also knew that if I didn't do it, I would suffer. I couldn't continue living with this burden of uncertainty. That evening, when he came home, I was sitting on the couch, trying to collect my thoughts. He noticed that I looked tense, and his eyes became wary. He came over, sat next to me, and gently took my hand. I knew that if I didn't tell him now, I wouldn't be able to sleep or continue to build something real with him. My heart was pounding and my head was filled with the words I was going to say to him, but there was always one big "but what if he didn't understand?" "I have to tell you something," I began. My words were firm, but there was still worry in my eyes. I felt like this was going to be a turning point for us. He smiled, relaxing his shoulders slightly, and said, "You know you can always talk to me. You know I'll always listen to you." But it was that very phrase that caused doubt to creep into me. What if he wasn't ready to hear the truth? What if he didn't know how I really felt? I took a deep breath, feeling my words catch in my throat. I was on the verge of saying something important, something that could change everything. "You know," I continued, trying to gather all my thoughts together, "we've had some wonderful times together, and I really love you. But there are things I can't forget, things I found when I was checking your social media." I saw a flash of alarm in his eyes, but he didn't interrupt. He sat silently, waiting for me to continue. "I saw a video of you having sex with another girl, and it hurts. I feel betrayed because you never told me about it. You promised you'd be open and honest with me, and I found this out on my own. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I felt like every sentence I said was splitting the silence in the room. His face turned pale at first, and then he took a deep breath, as if he was preparing for a long explanation. "I understand that you might feel betrayed," he finally said, and his voice was calm, but I could hear the tension in it. "I never meant for you to feel that way. It was a long time ago, before we started dating. And I was in a different place in life." I felt heavy from his words. He said that it was before us, that it didn't matter, but for me it mattered. If he was ready to tell me about his life now, then why didn't he tell me about everything that happened before? "Why didn't you tell me when we started dating?" I asked, trying to hold back tears. "Why did you keep this from me?" He paused, as if trying to find words that could explain his actions. He continued to look at me, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. It seemed to me that he did not know how to say something that could possibly destroy everything. You don't know what I went through in my last relationship. It was pain, and I didn't want to put that on you. I didn't want you to think that I was some kind of bad person because of what happened before us." I felt his words touch me, but it didn't take away the pain of what I saw. I couldn't just close my eyes to everything I found. My heart wouldn't stop pounding with tension, and even though I wanted to believe his words, the doubts that grew inside me grew stronger. "You say you didn't want to take your pain out on me," I said, trying to remain calm. "But now I feel the pain of not being part of your past, of not knowing all of this. It's not fair to me." He rubbed his face with his hands, and I could see him struggling to find an explanation for his actions. His eyes were full of apologies, but they weren't enough for me to feel like everything would be like before. I know I should have told you, and I'm so sorry I didn't. But I ask you to understand that I really love you, and I don't want to lose you because of what happened before. His words resonated in my head, but what if this was just his way of keeping me close? How could I trust him after everything I'd learned? He kept telling me he loved me, that he wanted to be with me, but I felt like something wasn't quite true. There was no way he could be so open with me if his past was so important to him. You say you love me, I said, barely holding back tears. But how can I know it's true if you don't open up to me completely? I don't want to be with someone who hides his past from me. I saw not only pain in his eyes, but also determination. He seemed to understand that this was a conversation that could change everything. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't rid myself of the doubts that were eating away at me from the inside. I understand, he said, and I noticed his voice was weak. I'm willing to work on myself to be the best for you. You deserve only the truth. I was silent. His words couldn't bring back the sense of safety I once felt with him. I didn't know what to make of this conversation, didn't know how to move forward. The words "I love you" were important, but they didn't solve my problems, didn't lift the shadow that now hung between us. It had been a few days since that conversation, and despite his best efforts to show that he was willing to work on himself, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. Every morning I woke up thinking about how much he had left behind, and how hard it was for me to cope with that weight. It was like trying to hold something alive and fragile in my hands until it became hard and cold. I felt it slowly eroding my confidence, my feelings for him. I tried to convince myself that things would get better, that he really wanted to change his ways for me, for us. He told me that he loved me, that he was willing to be honest, that he was willing to leave the past behind. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to doubt it. Why wouldn't it go away? Why did his past keep coming between us? Every time I looked at his face, at his smile, I tried to find the same feelings there that were there before, when I looked at him, and did not think about the fact that his past could ever interfere with our relationship again. But now it was different. I looked for signs of falsehood, looked for something that could prove to me that he was not hiding anything anymore. It became my obsession to decipher his every move, every word, every motion. I even started checking his phone, even though he knew I had access to it. He was sure that if I was looking for something hidden, it would only be my own fears and doubts, not a real threat. He didn't understand how much it was tormenting me. It was like a battle where I was losing, but I couldn't stop because the feelings he was causing me were too strong for me to just give up on them. I tried to sort out my feelings, asking myself, why can't I just trust him? He said he wanted to be with me, that he was willing to work on himself. Isn't that what I always wanted? Why is it so hard for me to forget what I saw? Why does every like he gave to another girl's photo, every word that haunted me, hurt so much? The process of self-discovery was painful. I couldn't find answers to my questions. All these doubts were eating me up inside. I felt unsure of myself, unsure of his love, and unsure of my own feelings. I was worried that if I kept looking for something hidden, it would ruin everything. But how could I let go of my fears if they had become part of my perception of our relationship? Every night, when I went to bed, I tried to calm myself down. I tried to tell myself that all these feelings were just the result of fear and uncertainty, that everything would be okay if I trusted him. But a deep uneasiness would not leave me. As soon as I closed my eyes, thoughts would come to me again. If he really loved me, why didn't he tell me everything I had learned right away? Why did he leave me in the dark, forcing me to unravel his past on my own? One evening, as I sat in our shared room, pondering what I should do, I felt his presence across from me become alien. He sat next to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on different planets. He tried to smile at me, but something about his smile didn't give me peace. I looked at him and felt a chill run down my spine. He was here, next to me, but his past was still between us. It couldn't be erased by one conversation, by his desire to change. He noticed that I was silent and asked what was wrong. I shook my head, not knowing how to explain my feelings. I couldn't tell him that I was worried, that I was scared, that I was hurt. I was ashamed. I was ashamed of my doubts, of my worries, which I thought could ruin our relationship if I didn't deal with them. I thought that if I told him about it, he would think that I didn't trust him, that I was weak, that I couldn't forgive him. But I couldn't keep quiet. I couldn't be with him if all this was going to sit in my soul like an unquenched fire. I stood up and walked to the window, looking at the night city outside. Everything seemed so distant and alien. My thoughts were like an endless river, flowing in different directions. I closed my eyes and felt the cold hand of fear squeezing my heart. He came to me, but I couldn't tell him that I was worried. I just said quietly, I need time. I wanted him to understand that I couldn't immediately deal with what he had told me. I couldn't forgive him right away. I couldn't let go of everything I had seen. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I could overcome all these doubts and go back to the relationship we had. He nodded, and I felt his gaze soften. He wasn't asking me to make any immediate decisions or trying to make me feel anything. He was giving me time, but I wasn't sure I could find the strength to go through with it. I stood by the window, watching the night swallow the city, and I knew that the road ahead would be long, but I needed to figure out myself, my feelings, what I wanted from this relationship. I couldn't continue to be with him if I couldn't let go of my fears. But how could I do that if his every gesture, every word reminded me of a past I couldn't forget? A few days had passed since that conversation, and I felt heavy again. My heart continued to pound every time I met his gaze when we talked. I couldn't shake the feeling that something important between us had disappeared. He tried to be there, he showed concern, but his concern only became a reminder that I couldn't be calm until my feelings were sorted out. I sat in the room, thinking about what was happening. All I felt was an unbearable weight on my chest. I couldn't go on like this. This inner turmoil left me feeling empty. I was afraid that if I didn't make a decision, it would make me. But what should I choose? Leave everything as it was, not knowing if I could handle this weight, or end the relationship so I could feel whole again. Every morning I woke up with this thought, no matter what he said or how he tried to convince me that he was there for me. All I felt was pain and uncertainty. I couldn't figure out how I could continue to trust him when I couldn't forget what I'd seen. My heart was split in two, one part reaching out to him, and the other part remaining doubtful, worried about his past and what I'd already discovered. And the more I tried to tell myself that everything would be okay, the more I felt the doubt grow. One evening, as we sat in our house, I decided that I needed more than just words. I couldn't continue to be with him unless I got it all clear. I wanted to understand what was really going on, what was behind all his explanations, what was behind his actions. I asked him if we could talk. He nodded, his face becoming more serious, as if he knew this wouldn't be an easy conversation. He sat across from me, and I tried to find the right words. I didn't want to blame him. I didn't want to dig up the past again. I just wanted to know the truth. I need to understand how you felt when all this happened, I said quietly, not knowing how he would react to my words. He looked at me, and I saw sincerity flicker in his eyes, but also fear. He was silent, and I felt the tension in the air increase. I knew he wanted to be honest, but my questions were stumping him. My need for reassurance was so great that it made me ask for more. But each answer only opened up more questions. You didn't tell me everything right away, I continued. I feel like it has something to do with what you went through earlier. But why couldn't you tell me? Why weren't you honest? He sighed and covered his face with his hands. I saw his shoulders tense, and in that moment I realized that his past was really still holding him back. He couldn't forget it, and it was dragging him down like a heavy anchor, and I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know how to explain it to you, he said finally. His voice was hoarse, as if he was experiencing something inside that he couldn't put into words. I was afraid you wouldn't understand, that it would hurt you. I was silent, trying to process his words. It hurt me to hear them. I didn't want his past to define us, but I couldn't just ignore something that was hard for me to understand. I couldn't trust what he was saying again when his past was so hazy and incomplete. Do you think I couldn't understand? I asked, and there was a bitterness in my voice that reflected my internal struggle. I would understand if you told me everything. I didn't know it was so difficult for you. I thought we could be honest with each other. He lowered his head again and said quietly, you're right. I was selfish. I didn't want you to think that I was like other men, that I wasn't worthy of you. But I didn't know how to tell you that it was just a part of me, a part of my past. My eyes filled with tears, but I held them back. Everything he said was hard, and I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't just forgive him and move on, but I couldn't leave him either. I knew this situation was more complicated than I thought. He wasn't just someone I could relate to. He was a complex person with his own pain and fears, and I couldn't ignore what he'd been through, but it was so hard to deal with. I felt a tightness in my chest, and I knew I needed something more. I couldn't be with him if I couldn't forget, and I couldn't forgive. He wasn't just the ideal, not just the person I dreamed of being with. He was a person with his own baggage, and I knew I had to accept that now. But was that what I wanted? I don't know if I can get over this, I told him, not knowing how hard my words sounded. I love you, but I can't get over what I learned. I don't know how I can be with you if I can't accept your past. He took my hand and I felt his gaze become softer, full of regret. I'm willing to wait if you want me to wait, he said with quiet determination. I understand if you decide we're not meant to be, but I don't want to lose you. His words were like a cold shower, and I felt an unbearable pressure growing in my chest. I couldn't give him an answer because I didn't know what I needed. I was trying to understand what was going on in my soul, what I really needed from this relationship. I sat with him, his hand in mine, and I realized that everything I felt was not how I imagined it would be when I started this relationship. It was more complicated than I thought, and I didn't know if I could find my way through this maze we had built together, but it was getting more confusing with each passing day. The nights grew quieter and I sank deeper into my thoughts. Sometimes it seemed to me that they could swallow me whole, that my worries and questions about the future were so strong that I could no longer get out of this labyrinth. I sat in my room, alone, thinking that I needed to make a decision. Something needed to be decided, because every day, every moment of doubt, took more and more strength from me. There was an emptiness inside me that nothing could fill, not his words, not his promises. It all sounded too distant, too implausible. I kept asking myself questions that I couldn't find answers to. Could I forgive him for his past? Could I leave him behind so as not to ruin our future? The thought of leaving him was not pleasant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I couldn't move forward with the weight he had left me with. I was afraid that I would never be able to recover from what I had been forced to see and learn about his past. His past didn't just not let go of me, it held me in its shackles, forcing me to doubt every step, every word, every minute. Everything I was going through made me think that I had to change something. I sat there, listening to time go by, and in my head, those moments when I felt pain, despair, and resentment kept coming back. But at the same time, I knew that I had to do something. I had to stop this endless cycle. I had to decide what I was going to do next. That day came, and I knew I couldn't go on like this. I was tired of the constant worry, the constant doubt. I felt like if I didn't make a decision now, time itself would make the decision for me. I knew I couldn't continue being with him if I was constantly doubting myself in our relationship. I couldn't live like this, restlessly feeling like we were both too stuck in his past to move forward. I had to talk to him. It was inevitable. I couldn't hide the truth from myself any longer. I couldn't stay in this swamp of uncertainty. I thought that if I kept living like this, one day it would just destroy me, and I couldn't afford to live another day in this trap. I had to make a choice. When I sat down across from him, I saw the familiar worry in his eyes. He sensed that something was wrong. He knew that our conversations were becoming increasingly difficult, that we were starting to look for a way out of the situation we found ourselves in. But I couldn't keep quiet. I couldn't be afraid to tell the truth, afraid to make a choice. I don't know if I can get over this, I began, feeling how hard it was for me. I don't know how to live with what I know about your past, with what I've seen. I want to believe you. I want to move forward. But all this won't let me go. He was silent, his eyes full of longing, and I could see how hard it was for him to hear this from me. He clenched his fists and finally answered, almost in a whisper, I understand. I don't want you to suffer because of my past. I know I was wrong, but I love you. I'm willing to work on myself, but I understand that if you're not ready to be with me, I can't force you. His words were full of sincerity, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that we were both stuck in this endless circle. I couldn't forgive him for his past, even though he tried to explain everything. I couldn't let go of all the feelings that tormented me, despite the fact that he wanted us to continue being together. I sat in silence, unsure of what to say. I wished it were easier, that I could just forget everything I'd learned, but I knew that wouldn't be possible. I knew I couldn't be with him if I kept living in the past. And most importantly, I realized I wasn't ready to leave everything behind. I wasn't ready to stay in this relationship if it was destroying me from the inside. I can't go on like this, I said, pain in my voice. I can't be with you if I can't forgive you. I can't live with this anymore. I can't carry this burden. I know you love me and I love you too, but I can't just leave this all behind. He nodded, and I saw his face fall with pain. He was probably hoping I would say something different, that I would say I was willing to move forward, despite everything. But I couldn't lie to myself. I couldn't just turn a blind eye to how I felt. I couldn't be with him if I couldn't forgive him for his mistakes. I understand, he replied quietly. I hope you find what you need, even if it's not with me. He stood up and walked slowly into the other room. I sat there, unsure of how to move forward. I felt tears starting to roll down my cheeks, but I didn't try to hold them back. This was a decision I knew I had to make, even if it was painful and hard. I knew maybe I should have done this sooner, but I wasn't ready. But now, in this moment, I knew I couldn't continue. I had made my choice, and although it was painful, I knew it was the right move for me. At some point, you had to let go to move forward, and maybe this move would set me free. But as I sat in the room, surrounded by silence, I knew one thing. I could no longer let my past ruin my future. Story 5, when I first met her, I had no idea that she would become a part of my life. Our paths crossed by chance, in the midst of a mundane routine, but something in her gaze immediately caught my attention. Her energy, special, somehow bright, made me think about how we could influence each other. At that moment, I did not know that our relationship, which began as something easy, would certainly change me. We started dating pretty quickly, and with each new date, I became more and more immersed in her world. I was genuinely surprised by how deep her personality was, despite the lightness of her appearance. She was multifaceted, her inner world was rich and full of different layers, and every day with her was like a discovery. I realized that I was not just attracted to her appearance, but to her intelligence, her approach to life, her sincerity and willingness to be vulnerable. She did not hide her emotions, and this was her strength. She was real, and this realness was very attractive to me. But despite our good compatibility, there was something more that made me think. From the first months of our relationship, I noticed that she needed constant confirmation of our connection, the certainty that I was there, that I would not leave. It was like pressure that was beginning to affect me. I understood that for her, this was not just a relationship, but a chance perhaps for something more, for the stability that she had apparently been looking for so long. She was looking for confidence that her love was valuable, that her feelings could be accepted without conditions. The process I was gradually getting involved in seemed logical and right to me. We started seeing each other almost every day. It was important to her, and I gradually began to get attached to this habit of being close. We spent time together, walked around the city, discussed films, books, dreams. Every day I felt more and more how she was changing, how she was entering my life more deeply. She was emotionally open, and sometimes it even seemed too intense, but at the same time I felt that her desires and needs had become a part of me. It was like something natural to be with her, to spend time, to share this world for two. At some point, she suggested that I move in with her. She didn't say it harshly, but I realized that she really wanted me to be around all the time. I was a little wary, but at the same time I didn't want to upset her. I agreed to this step, but with a caveat: before doing anything serious, I would like her to meet my family and friends. This was important to me. I wanted her to understand where I am in my life, who I communicate with, what is important to me. But what should have been a logical step in our relationship became a source of tension. She was not ready to meet my family and friends. I felt it when she started avoiding meeting people who meant a lot to me. It irritated me. I didn't understand why it was so difficult. Why was it so difficult for her to understand that I wanted to share an important part of my life with her? I tried to explain to her that this was not just a formality, but an important element in us becoming even closer. But she kept postponing these meetings, making up different excuses, and it began to bother me. Meanwhile, despite these problems, our intimacy continued to grow. We were together constantly. With each passing day, I began to feel more and more that we were not just a couple, but something more, that we were merging into one. But sometimes, her need for constant confirmation of our connection seemed burdensome to me. It seemed that I could not keep up with this flood of emotions with her desire for certainty. All of this made me feel as if I constantly had to justify myself, to prove that I was there, that I would not leave. And yet, despite the tension, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that our relationship was exactly what I needed. I loved the way she saw the world, the way she inspired me to think in new ways, to approach life in new ways. I loved the way she viewed my life, the way she supported me through difficult times. She was looking for depth and seriousness, and I wanted that too. But sometimes her need for constant reassurance created a sense of pressure in me that I couldn't always accept. I couldn't help but notice how our relationship was becoming more intense. It was becoming more and more difficult for me to meet her expectations, especially when she started telling me about her past, about what had happened to her in previous relationships. These stories, although important to her, were starting to affect me. I felt how her traumas, her emotional wounds were starting to be projected onto our relationship. I tried to understand her, but I couldn't always support her. Sometimes her stories about her ex-partners seemed too revealing to me, and I didn't know how to respond. I understood that a relationship with someone who had been through a lot of painful situations required much more patience and understanding. But I also felt that these moments when she kept returning to her past were starting to bother me. I wanted our relationship to be based on us, not on her memories. I didn't know how to explain it properly without hurting her. Every time she talked about her exes, I tried not to show my anxiety, but something inside me was starting to freeze. It was becoming a strange combination of love and tension, and I was increasingly wondering what to do. We were closer than ever, but our relationship was slowly becoming filled with strange contradictions. It was a relationship full of passion and tension, but I knew that maybe we needed more time to figure out what we really meant to each other. I increasingly realized that for both of us, despite the passion and love, there remained important issues that were not so easy to resolve. The past is like a shadow that doesn't always stay in the past, especially when you start building a relationship with someone whose story is full of unknown twists and turns. Every day, I felt more and more like she was opening up pages of her life to me that she hadn't talked about before. Her stories were full of pain, disappointment, and failed attempts to build something solid and real. She shared this with me, and I felt that her wounds were still open. And although she tried to seem strong and independent, her words sounded like an undisguised longing for what was left behind. I knew she had had serious relationships before me, but the details of those stories remained a mystery. She made no secret of the fact that she had tried to find love several times, but each time something had gone wrong. She said that all her previous relationships had ended painfully, and that each time she had plunged into them, she had put not only her soul at stake, but also her deepest feelings. But the hardest part was that her past, despite all her attempts to start over, had not left her. Those relationships weren't just part of her story, they remained part of her present. And with each passing day, as she shared more with me, I increasingly found that this past was interfering with our moments, our conversations, the way she perceived me, and our relationship. She told me about how her ex-partners had undervalued her, used her, cheated on her. I heard the hurt in her voice that never went away. I heard her bitterly admit that every experience she had with men had left scars that still hadn't healed. And the strangest thing was that she couldn't or wouldn't leave those memories behind. It was hard for me to understand. Why couldn't she just forget those relationships, get rid of the memories that continued to hurt her? Why did her past men, the ones who were no longer part of her life, remain so important? I knew it wasn't easy for her. She was upset every time she thought about them. Her stories about the past were filled with emotions that were sometimes so strong that I didn't know how to react. What was I supposed to feel when she said that her ex-men still called her, wrote to her, left traces in her life? What was I supposed to feel when she said that some of them had been in her life for so long that they had become part of her inner world? I couldn't understand how she could hold it all together because I wanted to be close to her, and her past seemed too weighty, too heavy. But the weirdest thing about it was that despite her openness, she never asked me to get rid of my memories. I would talk about my previous relationships, and even though it hurt her, she didn't try to limit me in that way. But when it came to her exes, I found it hard not to notice how her words became increasingly confusing. She kept talking about people who had once been in her life, and even though she assured me it didn't matter, I could see how it affected her mood, how those memories came alive in her eyes. It was like a fog that hung around us all the time, preventing us from seeing the clear contours of the present. I was increasingly wondering how her past was affecting us. I didn't want to be the one to remind her of her exes at every turn, but when she kept returning to these topics, it became difficult for me to remain indifferent. On the one hand, I understood her. She was a person with a history, and this history was an inseparable part of her. I couldn't change it. But on the other hand, I felt that we needed to move forward and not constantly look back. It was then that I began to notice how her past life seemed to dictate our relationship. For example, she often talked about her exes as if those relationships were still alive in her mind. Even those who were no longer in her life were like shadows that continued to haunt her, influencing her decisions and feelings. One of these moments was her behavior with the things these men had given her. For example, the 2 teddy bears that she still kept, despite the fact that her ex had given them to her, were simply cute to her. I felt like I had a hard time accepting this gesture. They were part of her past and I wanted her to break free from it. But she still held on to them, as if she couldn't let go. This became a symbol for me of how her past continued to occupy a place in her life. At some point, I realized that I couldn't completely get rid of the feelings of jealousy and insecurity that arose when I thought about her exes. Every time she started talking about them, I felt heavy. I wanted her to tell me, "You are more important to me than anyone else," but it didn't happen. She couldn't take that step. Her fears and worries about the past did not allow her to fully commit to the current relationship, and I increasingly wondered, when will her past finally become her past and not part of our present? I knew it wasn't easy to let go of old attachments and memories, but I wanted her to be able to let them go for us. I didn't want us to live in the shadow of her previous relationships. I wanted us to create something of our own, something new and unique. And at that moment, I realized that this would be a difficult path for both of us, a path where we would need to learn not only to love, but also to let go. I can't help but feel like at some point, our relationship began to be overshadowed by her past. It wasn't just a matter of jealousy or insecurity, it was something more complex, a sense that, despite my best efforts, her past remained too much of a part of her life for us to move forward in ours. I began to notice that, despite her telling me she wanted to settle down, despite her words about wanting to build a future with someone, I couldn't help but sense how often her thoughts kept returning to that relationship she couldn't leave behind. Every morning I woke up and felt myself falling deeper into the world of her memories, into the world of her past, which, despite all her attempts to keep silent, was always there. Sometimes I caught her eye when she looked at pictures of her exes about what they had once done for her. It was a kind of nostalgia or maybe regret, but something inside me was bothering me. Why was she clinging to these moments so much? Why couldn't she leave them where they belonged? Why did her exes, the people she was no longer with, still influence her perception of the world and therefore our future together? I thought about this a lot. When she talked about the relationships that tormented her and left her broken, I felt genuinely sorry for her. I wanted to be the one to support her, to help her heal and believe in love again. But when I heard how often she returned to these topics, it became difficult for me to understand. Was she making too much space for those who were no longer in her life? Were they that important to her? Or perhaps she simply could not cut ties with the past? One of the most disturbing things for me was her attitude towards photography. She still had pictures of her exes, and even though she claimed they were just memories of good times, I still couldn't understand how she could have something in her life that constantly reminded her of people who were no longer meant to be a part of her present. What especially bothered me was that she didn't immediately suggest deleting the pictures. I suggested that she do so not because I wanted her life to be erased of memories, but because I wanted her to be free to move forward without having to look back on what was behind her. But her reaction was strange. It was as if she couldn't understand why this was so important to me. I didn't say it to her directly, but I was finding it increasingly difficult to watch her attachments to the past. It seemed like her entire focus was on maintaining the illusion that her exes were more than just exes. It was like constantly returning to moments that she said she should have forgotten, but somehow, for her, they weren't. She said they were an important part of her life, and maybe that was true, but wasn't it time to let go? One of the most upsetting things I had a hard time digesting was her behavior with her teddy bears. They were gifts from her exes, and while she claimed she was just attached to them because they were cute, I felt like that wasn't true. They weren't just toys, they were symbols of her past relationships. And while she said she didn't care, I felt like she just didn't want to admit that these things were holding her back from fully letting go of her past life. Every time I tried to ask her questions about how she felt about our relationship, she would become withdrawn and say that she had no intention of repeating the mistakes she had made in the past. But what about the fact that she couldn't let go of the things, people, and memories that reminded her of that past? How could I feel that she was truly committed to our future when her thoughts so often wandered to people she should no longer have anything to do with? I didn't know what to do. I loved her and I wanted to be with her, but I felt like our relationship couldn't move forward until her past was in the past. I was willing to support her, to be there for her, but I had a hard time understanding how I could move forward if she was still holding on to the past. When we talked about the future, she said the right things. She said she wanted us to build something together, that we could be happy. But how could we be happy if her past was still haunting us? This conflict within me grew with each passing day. I wanted her to be able to let go of her attachments, to give our future a chance, rather than live in the shadow of what had been. But I also knew that this was much more difficult for her than I could have imagined. I couldn't make her forget. I couldn't make her change how she felt, and that was what worried me. I was afraid that I would be the one who stayed in her life only because she couldn't forgive herself for her past mistakes. And while I was willing to support her, I increasingly felt like this path to the future might be much more thorny than I thought. With each passing day, our relationship became more and more complicated, and I began to feel the misunderstanding between us growing. I wasn't sure how to perceive her. She was on the verge of openness, but at the same time, it was as if she remained behind a wall that I couldn't get past. All her talk about ex-partners, her strange behavior with teddy bears left over from previous relationships, all this created an atmosphere in which I felt in the shadow. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was not absolutely the most important thing for her, that her feelings for me could not be the same as mine. Every day I tried to figure out where she was. Just when everything seemed to be going our way, it was like everything was falling apart. I was sure that she saw me as her partner, that she genuinely wanted to be with me. But sometimes her reactions to my words and actions made me doubt. Everything was too subtle, like the insecurity that emanated from her. I noticed how nervous she became if I mentioned my exes or something from my past. She sometimes stopped listening, her eyes became distant, and I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know how she really felt when I talked about something that related to my past. Why did these topics bother her so much? In these moments, I felt uneasy. I was ready to share everything about myself, but it was as if she couldn't do the same, or didn't want to. I felt like this uncertainty in her behavior was overshadowing my own feelings. We both said that we wanted a relationship, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she had too many unresolved issues in her head, and I was just part of the solution. Part of what she couldn't leave behind. I never knew what to expect from her in these moments. Sometimes she was open, sincere, but sometimes I felt like her thoughts were far from us, like she was in some other world that wasn't connected to us. It bothered me. It was especially hard when she tried to rationalize her behavior by saying that she didn't want to create anything new for fear of disappointing me. It was as if she was worried about every move we made, as if she was afraid that when I started seeing her with all her insecurities, I would leave. This fear pushed me away, as if her relationships with her exes had left her not only with scars but also with a lingering fear of losing another person. I understood that this was a result of her past traumas, but it was hard for me to be in this place where my efforts to support her weren't met with the same openness from her. It was strange to feel that despite all our conversations, she still couldn't be fully with me, with the feelings she truly felt. While I was genuinely falling in love with her, her reactions and behavior made me doubt how important I was to her. I didn't demand blind affection from her. I didn't expect her to completely forget her past relationships, but it hurt me to realize that I was just a part of her life, not its center. Her fears and insecurities about her past were palpable at every turn. When we were alone, I saw how she seemed to make an effort to be there, but there was often a flicker of worry in her eyes. She began to worry too much about every little thing, about every word I said. It was strange and made me feel like she couldn't trust me completely. It was hard for me to understand what exactly was stopping her from opening up. What was the reason her affection for me seemed more and more artificial? My feelings for her grew stronger, but I increasingly felt that the intensity of my feelings was not being met with a response. It was like I was walking on one side of the road and she was on the other, always hesitant, always at a loss. I couldn't get her to move faster or in the direction I felt our relationship should go. She was always lagging behind, as if she was waiting for her past mistakes, her insecurities about her deservingness of love, to dictate her actions. It was hard to live with. I could see how she was still building a wall between us, and that wall wasn't made of stone, but of her own experiences, fears, and doubts. She couldn't allow herself to be with someone as fully as I was willing to be with her. I saw how her behavior changed, how her words became less sincere, and her reactions more distant. Everything she said was subject to this constant struggle between the desire to be with someone and the fear that this someone would leave too. When I thought about it, I didn't know what to do. I loved her, but her inner world was so confusing that I didn't know how to help her, how to get her to let go of her fears and give us a chance. My efforts seemed futile. Every day I felt more and more that our relationship was not a path that we could both walk with ease. I tried to be patient, but sometimes I just wanted to take her hand and say, just be with me. But it seemed much more difficult for her to understand that being with someone didn't necessarily mean losing yourself. I began to realize more and more that our future depended not only on how much time we spent together, but also on how much she was willing to open up. My patience and willingness to go at her own pace no longer seemed so certain. I felt myself losing myself in trying to decipher her world, which was too constricted and full of anxiety. At some point, I began to realize that the relationship with her was becoming not so much a joy as a test. Every attempt to deepen our feelings ran into her internal barriers. She could not understand that it was important for me to be close and build a future without looking back. I increasingly felt that she could not choose, could not trust me completely. This constant fear of the future seemed to be so deeply rooted in her that I did not know how to help her overcome it. We started spending more time together, but the more I got to know her, the more it became apparent that her past relationships had left her with deeper scars than I could have imagined. I could see her holding back when I brought up things from my past. It was like she was reliving the moments when she lost people, and she was afraid of losing me the same way. It was like an invisible wall between us she was afraid to open up because she didn't want to experience that disappointment again. This left me with mixed feelings. I couldn't figure out what exactly made her so afraid. Not that her exes weren't good partners, but rather that they left her, leaving her heartbroken. I couldn't tell her that my intentions were honest, that I had no intention of betraying her. But apparently she'd been through this so many times that she was afraid that I would be the next one to hurt her. I understood that she couldn't get rid of her fears instantly, that she needed support and patience. But what worried me was how her fears were increasingly distancing her from me. Even if she said she was ready to be with me, her actions said otherwise. Every time we tried to take the next step, she seemed afraid that our relationship would become something too serious. She told me that she wanted stability, but her behavior proved the opposite. When I suggested that she talk about our future, she immediately became nervous, looking for ways to avoid the conversation. It was like two worlds colliding. On the one hand, I felt like we needed to move forward, to build a relationship, but on the other, her inner world was so fragile and closed that I didn't know how to approach her pain. I loved her, but I didn't know how to deal with someone who couldn't allow herself to be truly vulnerable, who couldn't fully trust. I thought that if she could only see me the way I saw her, not as a threat, but as a supportive partner, we could get through this. But every effort I made became a source of fear for her, as if the closer we got, she would lose control. Her past became a real obstacle. She often told me that she didn't want to repeat those mistakes, that she didn't want to get into a relationship that would lead to disappointment again. But despite these words, I felt that she still couldn't get out of this circle of fear. She couldn't leave everything behind, because every time she started thinking about the future, she was overcome with anxiety again. I tried to be patient, understanding, but sometimes I was afraid that I was delaying too much, that her fears could take over. What bothered me most was that she couldn't accept the fact that I was ready to go into the future with her, despite everything she had been through. She couldn't believe it, and I didn't know how to prove my sincerity to her. Every time she tried to change something to make our relationship more real, I felt how she still remained wary. My feelings, my words seemed insufficient for her to believe in me. Every day I became more and more tired of this internal conflict. I loved her, but I felt that her fears were getting in the way of us building something real. I tried to be there for her, to support her, to show her that we could move forward, that everything that happened before us was her past, and that I was not going to be part of those mistakes. But her fears remained with her. Every doubt she had became more and more difficult for me, and I didn't know how to help her let it go. Our every interaction was now tied to her fear that I would leave, that I wouldn't be with her, that we couldn't be happy. She was increasingly withdrawn, and though I tried to be supportive and patient, I couldn't help but feel that she was having a hard time letting me be there for her fully. Nothing I did seemed enough because she couldn't trust that I wasn't going to leave her. I wanted to find a way out of this cycle, but I didn't know how. I loved her and I was ready to build a future with her, but her fears about the future seemed insurmountable. The more I tried to help her, the more I felt like we were stuck in the past, and I didn't know how to get either of us out of it. With each passing day, I realized more and more that our relationship could not move forward until her past stopped affecting us. It was hard to realize that, despite all my love and willingness to be there for her, I could not change what she had gone through. Her past relationships, her mistakes, her pain, all of it was like a shadow that followed us, preventing us from moving forward. I always knew that the past leaves traces, but I did not know that it could hold a person in its chains so strongly. Every time I tried to talk to her about our future, about me being ready to move forward, she would start to close off. I could see her face change when I brought up something from her past. It seemed like every memory of her past relationship was a bigger barrier for her than it was for me. It was as if her past wouldn't let go, even when she was trying to be with someone new. I tried to understand what she needed, but every gesture, every look in her eyes told me that she couldn't let go of what she had. I could see her past experiences seeping into our present. Her entire behavior was colored by these experiences, and I could sense how she was holding back her feelings, afraid that they might lead her to pain again. I didn't know what to do in this situation. I truly believed that we could be happy if only she could let go of these memories. But something inside her didn't allow her to fully trust me. She kept talking about her past relationships, even when I asked her not to. And each time it gave me a strange feeling. Something was stopping her from being here with us with the present. Sometimes it felt like we weren't living in the present, but in some indefinite space between her past and mine. We were connected, but we couldn't be truly open with each other because her fears and doubts prevented us from fully immersing ourselves in what was between us. I began to feel like she couldn't see me as a partner, not as a shadow of her ex, but as a separate person who was ready to walk with her into the future. Her exes always came back into our conversations. I could hear her reminiscing about them, as if trying to figure out what was wrong. I tried to explain to her that I wasn't the same person, that I couldn't be a part of what she was going through. But she couldn't seem to understand. Every time I said I wanted to move on, she responded hesitantly, as if her attachment to me wasn't complete, but part of what she was still going through. She said she wanted to be free of the past, but her actions said otherwise. It was hard. I knew she couldn't fully let go of what had happened, and that her fears about the relationship were real and deep. But I didn't know how to help her. I didn't know how to support her when she couldn't let herself forget what had happened. We tried to move forward, but I felt like her past kept pulling us back. Her fear of the future, of losing me again, was so strong that I sometimes felt like we couldn't be real for each other, like there would always be this wall of her past between us, preventing us from building something new. I didn't know how I could be with her if she couldn't be with herself. I couldn't be a part of her past, but she kept holding on to it, and it made me doubt that our relationship could be more than just an attempt to avoid pain. I felt increasingly tired. I loved her, but I didn't know how to go on if her past continued to influence my every word and action. I tried to talk to her, asking her to explain what was stopping her from being truly with me, but each time her answers were confused, reserved. I couldn't understand why she couldn't give us a chance, why she couldn't forget that relationship that I thought had no meaning for a long time. Every time we discussed our relationship, I felt our connection weaken. She closed off again, became insecure again. I didn't know how to help her. I didn't know how to make her believe that I wasn't the same person as her exes, that I wanted to be with her, not her past. And at some point, I began to wonder if our relationship would turn into a never-ending reliving of her past. I thought again about her request to settle down. She had said it, but her actions contradicted her words. It seemed she couldn't allow herself to be in the present without looking back. And maybe that was the hardest part. I couldn't make her forget what she had been through, but I couldn't continue to build a relationship if her past was constantly ruining our present. I often asked myself this question: what's next? We had been through so much, but it increasingly felt like we were stuck in some endless cycle where the past was always holding us back. I was ready to open my life to her, ready to build a future with her, but her fears and indecision did not give me the slightest sense of confidence that she wanted the same. It was not just a question of trust, it was something deeper, her attitude towards past relationships and towards herself. Every time we tried to talk about the future, she started avoiding the topic. She wasn't ready to take the step that would be logical for a normal, healthy relationship. I kept trying to find a way to explain to her that I wasn't her ex, that I wasn't going to betray her, that I was ready to walk beside her, to support her, to be a part of her life. But she couldn't accept it, and I started feeling like her past was overshadowing everything else again. I was hurting. I didn't know how to help someone who felt so attached to their pain and their scars. She was a wonderful woman, and I felt like we could be a perfect couple if only she could let go of everything that held her back. I saw her reaching out to me, but her every move was limited by this invisible barrier that she couldn't break. We started arguing more and more, and although I tried to be supportive, it wasn't enough. I tried to explain that I didn't want to blame her, that I understood her fears, but her reaction only increased my doubts. She couldn't understand why I wasn't ready to just put an end to it and move on without looking back. Every word, every action was important to her, and I began to feel that it was more important for her to keep her distance than to be truly close. I began to doubt whether I should continue this relationship. Every time we tried to talk, I felt our connection weakening, our conversations turning into empty words that could not change what she felt inside. I loved her, but I did not know how to free her from these invisible shackles that she had imposed on herself. I tried to be the person who would be there for her, who would support her, but it was not so easy anymore. Over time, I began to realize that maybe our relationship couldn't last as much as I wanted it to. Maybe I was too dependent on us moving forward, on building something real, and she was constantly pulling us back, despite my best efforts. I began to ask myself, what if she's not ready to be with me, not ready to fully trust and let go of the past? And if that's the case, does it make sense to continue to fight for this relationship when I feel like her very soul is left in the past? As time went on, I realized I had to make a decision. I couldn't be in a relationship where I didn't feel reciprocated, where I couldn't move forward because someone was constantly holding me back. And if she couldn't let go of her fears and trust me completely, then maybe it would be better for both of us to separate. After all, if I continued to stay with her despite her indecision, I would start to lose myself. I couldn't let myself forget about my own desires, about what was important to me. And then there came a point where I felt like I needed to take a break to figure out what I wanted. I don't know if it was the realization that she would never be able to fully trust me, or the fear that she could close herself off again at any moment. But I felt like it was up to her now. I gave her space to figure herself out and figure out what she really wanted. I wasn't sure I could wait forever. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was too impatient. But inside me, there was a feeling that if we didn't take this step forward together, if we couldn't work through our issues, this relationship was doomed to fail. I couldn't be part of her pain, part of her dysfunctional past. I couldn't continue to be with her if she couldn't let go of what was holding her back. She had to understand that if she wanted to be with me, she had to let go of her past. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew one thing: I couldn't be in a relationship that didn't allow me to be myself, where I didn't feel like I was moving forward, but instead was stuck in the past. And if I decided to stay, I would need to change something. We both needed to change so that we could be truly happy together. But before that happened, I had to take a step back and give us both time to process. Story 6, I remember the moment it all started. It was like a flash of bright light in my life that painted everything around me in new colors. We met by chance, but at the time it seemed like it was meant to be. In his eyes I saw something I had been looking for, but had never found. He was different, calm, a little distant, but easy to be with. It seemed like we immediately found a common language, that our views on life coincided, that our interests and preferences intertwined perfectly. Everything was new, everything seemed exciting and full of possibilities. We laughed together, shared our stories, expectations, and even dreams. He was passionate about his business. I was passionate about mine. I admired how he always confidently went towards his goals, how he had a clear picture of the world, how he knew what he wanted. In his presence, I felt special, despite the fact that there were things in his life that I did not quite understand. As time went on, we spent more and more time together. I was happy, but something inside me was starting to change. I liked being around him, and deep down I hoped that things would stay the way they were. But as we grew closer, I noticed more and more strange things. He was different from what I imagined the ideal partner to be. His attention would sometimes become intermittent, and his communication would become cold, as if his thoughts were far from me, as if he was not here, but somewhere else. At first it seemed like little things, little pauses, moments when I couldn't catch his eye, moments when he just didn't respond to my words. I thought he was just tired, or that he had something important that needed his attention. But over time, these moments became more frequent. We'd talk and he'd seem to be somewhere far away, absorbed in his own thoughts, problems, or simply playing on his phone. And then I'd start to feel unheard. The feeling of disappearing into the shadows of his world consumed me. But I couldn't understand why. Why couldn't we just be together like before? I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just his habit. We are all like that. Each of us has moments when we want to be alone or focus on something else. But each time, this distance between us became more and more noticeable. When I told him about my feelings, he responded with such calmness, as if nothing had happened. He said that it was not a problem, that it was just his character, that he was like this when he was focused on something. He did not understand that it hurt me. It was so natural for him that he could not see how much I suffered from it. I understood that you can't constantly impose your expectations on a person and that not everyone is ready and able to open up the way you want. But the more I tried to keep up with his pace, the more I felt like I was losing myself. It seemed like I was doing everything right, not asking for too much, not imposing my desires. But despite this, more and more it began to seem to me that I didn't matter. With each passing day, each time we spoke, I felt his attention becoming colder and colder, and I began to feel superfluous. He looked at the screen when I spoke, or answered with short phrases that did not reveal his thoughts. There were moments when I myself began to apologize for distracting him from his work, although in fact it should not have been so. I began to ask myself whether I was even on his horizon, or just a background figure that he noticed only occasionally. But at that moment, I could not understand why it affected me so much. I felt ashamed of my feelings. I tried to learn to accept that my expectations were too high. I didn't want to be the girl who demanded attention and complained all the time. I was afraid that if I complained, it would make me weak in his eyes. So I kept quiet, hiding my grievances, trying to get through it alone. I didn't want him to feel like I was blaming him. I tried to understand what I was missing, but I couldn't find an explanation for how I felt. At some point, it became clear to me that something in our communication was not the same as it had been before. I no longer felt the ease with which we communicated at the beginning. Now our conversations were more tense. They did not have the sincerity, the openness that we had before. It seemed that with each passing day I was losing a part of myself, and it was difficult to accept. But I still believed that if I tried to understand him, things could work out. I wanted to believe that this was just a phase, that it would all pass if I was patient. After all, he was such a wonderful person in so many other ways. He was patient and caring, especially when I was having a hard time. But despite all these good qualities, something inside me kept feeling that this wasn't quite what I was looking for in a relationship. I kept holding on to this idea that if I was patient, if I learned not to demand too much, things would work out. I believed that if we learned to be there for each other despite these little cracks that were starting to appear in our communication, everything would be okay. But I couldn't predict that there would be a much more difficult road ahead, one that would force me to really question what I wanted and needed from this relationship. I didn't expect our first major conflict to be so painful. We always fought over little things, but then, at that moment, I felt something break. It all started with something completely insignificant, with some misunderstanding, but it turned into something much more serious. That day started like any other. We spent the morning discussing our plans for the evening, and everything seemed calm. I noticed that he was again absorbed in something of his own as before, and I felt a little uneasy, but I decided that maybe it was just fatigue. He suggested that we meet later, and I agreed, although I was a little bit missing his attention. But I didn't say anything about it. I was trying not to be pushy. In the evening when we met, he was again focused on his phone, playing some game and talking to me without looking up from the screen. I knew that he did this when he was completely absorbed in something, and at some point I even tried to just sit next to him, not interfering. But the longer I sat there, the stronger my feeling became that I did not exist for him. I couldn't understand why. We had agreed to meet, and I thought it would be time for us, for the two of us. I tried to talk to him again. At first I was calm, hoping that he simply didn't notice how he was acting. I asked if he wanted to put the game aside for at least a few minutes to talk, but in response he said shortly, "I can't now. I have an important game." I felt something click inside me. This wasn't just a game, it was something much bigger that I couldn't understand. I tried to be patient, but the feeling of being invisible to him began to grow. I knew he could be passionate about his work, but I also knew he could be considerate and caring. When he wanted to continue, I tried again to explain that I needed him to be there so we could talk. But as always, he responded coldly, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't keep silent. It was too painful. I felt a wave of disappointment and confusion rise up inside me. I didn't know what to say, how to express my feelings. I started to speak with restraint, but my voice was already filled with anxiety, discontent, even resentment. He didn't react. He continued to play. And then I couldn't stand it anymore. I told him I couldn't go on like this. I told him I didn't understand why he couldn't give me some attention when we were together. I tried to explain that it was important to me, but he didn't respond. He went silent, and I felt something tighten in my chest. He put his phone down and finally looked at me. His face was serious, but there was no apology or understanding in his eyes. He said that that's just the way he is, that he couldn't help himself. It was like a cold shower. I'd heard it before, when he apologized for his behavior, but never said why he did it. Each time it sounded more empty. He didn't explain his actions, he just accepted them as something inevitable. I felt like I couldn't breathe. It was like everything I had hoped for and believed in was crumbling at that moment. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't. My emotions were pouring out, and I realized I couldn't hide how much pain I was in anymore. Then he started saying that he didn't want me to make a drama out of such trivial things. But for me, it wasn't a trivial thing. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a complete disregard for how I felt. I was trying to understand how you can ignore something like another person's feelings. After all, we're not just acquaintances, we're a couple. And for me, every moment we spend together, every moment we exchange words and time, is important. I didn't want our connection to be based only on silent expectations and not on real communication. I remembered how he always told me not to worry, that he loved me, that everything would be okay, and I tried to believe it. But his words no longer brought me comfort. I wanted to hear something that would show that he cared. I wanted to hear him apologize sincerely, but instead I heard the distant "I am like this. What can I do?" I felt small and helpless, like my feelings didn't matter. At that moment, I didn't know what to do. I didn't understand how we could continue a relationship if we couldn't even talk openly. I asked myself if I was being too sensitive or if there was something really missing in our relationship. But that question remained unanswered because his reaction was not what I expected from a partner. The conflict that started with a small thing became a turning point for me. I realized that we would have to decide how to live on, where we'll be able to understand each other, learn to talk openly about our feelings, or will we just continue to lose ourselves in this silence, trying to justify everything? With each passing day, it seemed more and more that he and I were beginning to live in different worlds. And this was not only about our interests or habits, but also about how we perceived our relationship. Everything that had previously seemed easy and relaxed now turned into routine, cold interactions, where I was increasingly alone in my experiences and he in his thoughts and activities. We continued to spend time together, but it was no longer the time we had imagined at the beginning. Before, when we met, it was like a flash, a moment that remained in the memory, a precious moment, full of expectations and pleasant surprises. But now, every evening became more and more like the previous one, as if we were already tired of each other's presence, as if everything that was between us had become a familiar background. I began to notice how often he would become absorbed in his games or other activities when I was around. Not always, but more and more often. At first, I tried not to notice. He would sit with his phone, discussing some detail of his game, and I would sit next to him, trying to find something to do so as not to interrupt him. But then it became clear to me that this was not just absorption, it was something more. It was avoidance. He avoided real communication. His gaze was absorbed in the screen. His reactions were short, and I could no longer find in them the warmth that once was there. It seemed easier for him to spend time with the game than with me. My attempts to start conversations about how I was feeling often ended with me hearing, "I'm focusing, not right now." He didn't hear me. I knew it wasn't personal, that he was always like this when he was doing something important to himself. But that didn't make it any easier. I couldn't help but feel rejected when he was paying more attention to the screen than to me. I tried to explain to myself that it wasn't the game or his hobbies that was at fault. It was his way of focusing. But what was I supposed to do with this feeling that I was in the background of his life? I tried to be tolerant, but each time it was more and more difficult for me to hide this feeling. I couldn't talk to him about it anymore. I was afraid that he would perceive my words as complaints, as an insult. After all, I didn't want to look weak or too emotional, but at the same time, I couldn't understand why he didn't notice how much pain I was in. Why didn't he feel that something was changing between us, that this coldness in his behavior made me doubt our connection? With each passing day, I felt a deeper void in our conversations. It wasn't something specific that I could explain. It wasn't one big argument or incident that was the catalyst. It was something that gradually built up inside me, like little slivers of ice, that over time began to form a thick layer that I couldn't ignore. And then came the moment when it seemed to me that I was completely absorbed in this viscous routine. We were sitting on the couch, he was playing his game again, and I was trying to concentrate on something of my own. At some point, I got up and left the room. I didn't know what to do, how to behave, how to react. I couldn't explain to myself why it bothered me so much. I couldn't understand why, when I was around, he so often forgot that there was also me, his partner. Was it really that hard to just pay attention to me? When I returned, he was still busy playing. I felt like I wanted to say something, to do something, to get his attention back, but I stayed silent. We didn't speak again. He didn't even notice when I left, and that hurt me even more. Eventually, I realized that our relationship was turning into endless cycles of silence, where we were physically close but emotionally distant. I couldn't figure out what to do about it, but something inside me told me that I couldn't continue like this. And again, as in the past, I tried to find an answer to this question. What should I do if my feelings do not matter to him? I understood that there are many things in his life that are important, and I could not demand his attention all the time. But shouldn't a relationship be something more than just a space where we exist next to each other, but not together? More and more, I felt the warmth and closeness that used to fill our days slipping away. I couldn't figure out where this change had happened, or why I was starting to feel like I was losing him. I thought that if I was more patient, if I just stayed close, things would get better. But the more I tried to understand him, the more lost I felt. I knew I would have to bring this up again at some point. I couldn't ignore what was happening to us. I couldn't allow myself to be part of this daily routine anymore, where we both just existed but didn't live. But at that moment, sitting next to him, I didn't know how to start the conversation. How to remind him again that I was here, and that I needed his attention so that we could at least try to get back what we had lost. As the days went by, an internal storm grew inside me that seemed invisible from the outside. I kept trying to find a balance between being tolerant and standing up for my feelings. But the more I tried to understand, the harder it became. My condition was getting worse, and I didn't know how to express it all. There was a constant internal conflict inside me. I increasingly questioned who I was in this relationship and what I really felt. I kept trying to justify his behavior. He was a good person, right? He had always been patient and caring in other aspects of our lives. When I was insecure or worried, he was always there, lending a shoulder to lean on. He never abandoned me during difficult times. But even so, something inside me kept screaming that I couldn't continue living in this relationship if it was as cold as it was now. As I sat with him in silence, trying to figure out what was wrong, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were losing each other. There was no longer the warmth in his eyes that there used to be. Sometimes when I looked at him, I began to doubt whether I even knew him. It wasn't just his habits that I could explain. It was something more like he was pulling away from me, not because of anything specific, but because he didn't know how to be there. It was something that didn't cause any obvious conflict, but that was internally destroying everything we had built. I tried to talk again. This time I decided not to bottle up my feelings, not to hide them inside, hoping that it would go away. I started the conversation by saying that I needed him to hear me, for him to understand that I wasn't just worried, but that I really cared about how we interacted. I explained to him that his silence, his ignoring me when I was around, hurt me, and I couldn't stay in this relationship if I didn't feel close to him. He was silent for a long time. I didn't know what he was thinking, what he was feeling. I just stood in front of him, trying to understand what could be hidden behind his gaze, which was still so indifferent. Finally, he answered. His words were cold as always and again expressionless. He said that he couldn't change himself, that he was like this when he was focused. I had heard it many times before, but this time it sounded like a blow. What should I do with this? What should you do when a person is not ready to change something for you, for the sake of your relationship? I felt my chest tighten, my eyes fill with tears, but I couldn't let myself cry. I didn't want to show him my weakness, even though I felt completely helpless at that moment. I tried again to explain that it wasn't about his passions, that it was about feeling him close, about being a part of his life. But again, nothing changed. Everything remained the same. There was confusion in his eyes, as if he couldn't understand what I wanted from him. He said again that he couldn't be with me all the time, that he had his own interests, and I had to understand. I tried to convey that I didn't need all his attention, but I did need at least a little of what we once had. But instead of trying to understand, he pulled away again, and I felt a gap form between us again. It wasn't just a game situation, it was something deeper. His ignoring me became a symbol of how he was becoming more and more distant, as if we were living in parallel worlds. I realized more and more that every time I tried to understand our relationship, I was faced with the fact that we didn't understand each other. I felt like I was confused about my feelings. I couldn't figure out what exactly I needed, and it was destroying me from the inside. I couldn't stay in this relationship any longer if it wasn't going to change. But I couldn't bring myself to break up. What if I was wrong? What if I was too sensitive? He was a good man, wasn't he? Why was it hurting so much if it wasn't that bad? My feelings were all mixed up like a ball of thread that you couldn't unravel because you didn't know where to start. I didn't know what I needed, more love, more attention, more understanding, or something else. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go on like this. And I began to wonder what would happen next. If I couldn't find the answers, if he didn't want to hear me, would we stay together? Or would we move on, each on his own path, regretting that we couldn't understand each other? In these moments, I often wondered how strong our connection was, and whether it was worth fighting for if we both felt lost. When I first fell in love with him, I thought our relationship would be easy and natural, like a dream of carefree happiness. We were so similar, and it seemed like it could not work. He was kind, considerate, patient, and all I wanted was to just be with him, to spend time with him, to support each other. I remembered how happy I was when he called me to his place, how important everything seemed, how unforgettable. But now, 7 months later, all I felt was disappointment, not because he had become a different person, but because I couldn't understand how it all had become so alien. My expectations were falling apart like a house of cards. I expected him to pay more attention to me, to understand when I felt abandoned. I wasn't asking for anything out of the ordinary. I wasn't demanding 100% of his time and energy every day. I just wanted a little bit, small signs of attention, the ability to feel his presence so I didn't feel invisible in his life. But those expectations were unfulfilled. When I started telling him how I felt, it felt like my words weren't getting through to him. He would either respond coldly, as if he didn't know what I was talking about, or he would immediately try to avoid the conversation, thinking I was asking too much. I looked to my friends for support, but they couldn't give me a definitive answer either. "Why don't you just talk to him directly?" they would ask. It sounded so simple, but every time I tried to bring it up, I felt my insides tighten. There was no answer that could fix everything. All he could offer was an apology, but it was never a real apology. I couldn't understand what was behind his words. He would often say that he was struggling, that he couldn't always be attentive when he was focused, but there was no explanation in his words, no attempt to understand what was happening to me, why I felt this way. Every day I spent with him felt emptier and emptier. He was there, but that didn't mean he was there for me. I could feel him drifting away, and it was becoming harder and harder to stay close to him. Why couldn't I leave my expectations behind and just accept him for who he was? Why did I need him to change, to become a different person, to pay more attention to me, to care more? Maybe it was my desire, not his responsibility. I didn't know, but it hurt. And with each passing day, the pain grew deeper. My sensitivity became my enemy. When I was around him, I was constantly trying to pick up on his mood, his reactions, his gestures. I expected him to see when I was hurt, when I felt lonely, when I needed support. But it didn't seem to happen. He was, as always, absorbed in his own world. I wondered, why can't I learn to just be happy with what we have, without constant worries and doubts? Why can't I just accept that this is his way of being in a relationship, and not my ideal? Every time I was alone with these thoughts, I felt even more confused. I couldn't figure out what was going on. There were moments when he cared, when he was there, when everything seemed real and sincere. But these were rare moments that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. They couldn't compensate for all the silence and coldness that filled the space between us on ordinary days. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't on the same page. He said he loved me, but his actions said otherwise. I tried to believe that this was just his way of expressing his feelings, that his love didn't have to be expressed in the way I expected. But it was hard to accept that I couldn't change my expectations, that I couldn't stop expecting what I had come to consider normal in a relationship. We continued to see each other every day, and it became increasingly difficult. His silence, his ignoring me when he was busy with his own affairs, caused me anxiety that grew deeper. I could no longer hide my disappointment, but I also couldn't figure out how to cope with it. Why was it so hard for me to just be there without pressure, without expectations? I knew I couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just a feeling of discontent or a momentary irritation. It was a feeling that filled me and prevented me from moving forward. I couldn't believe that we could go back to the way things had been unless I figured out what to do with this disappointment. But I didn't know how to take that step. The expectations I'd built up had become my own cages, and now I couldn't figure out how to break out of that prison without losing something important. When I woke up every morning, I thought that this day would be the same as the previous one. I told myself that all our problems were just temporary difficulties, that sooner or later everything would get better. I tried to convince myself that he and I could cope with this, if only I was patient and attentive enough. But every time I looked at him, when I heard his cold answers or watched him lose himself in his affairs again, I felt my strength draining. My feelings for him remained complicated, tangled like a ball of thread that I couldn't unravel. I increasingly felt like there was an invisible wall growing between us, and every day it grew higher and higher. It was as if we were sliding past each other, and every day it became more and more difficult for me to understand what was happening with our relationship. We continued to see each other, but this closeness became more and more illusory. I realized that I could no longer continue to live in this state when there was no sincerity between us. I was tired of playing with myself, tired of not being able to find the strength to admit that maybe my expectations were too high for this person. I could no longer sit in the shadow of my own doubts, hoping that everything would work out on its own. I knew I had to make a decision, but what decision? I didn't know what to do, but inside me there was a growing feeling that if I didn't take a step now, if I didn't speak out, I would lose what was left. One evening, sitting on my bed, I felt that familiar discomfort again. He was playing video games as usual, and I was sitting next to him, staring into space. I tried to speak, but as always, he didn't hear me. I couldn't stand watching him absorbed in his own activities, ignoring my presence. I couldn't stay in that silence anymore. The words I couldn't say before now came out of me. I started telling him that I was hurting. I told him that I felt unwanted, that every time he was lost in his own affairs, I felt him pulling away from me. There was confusion in his eyes again, as if he didn't know how I felt. He said, as always, that he couldn't control his habits, that he was like this, and that it wouldn't change. I felt anger growing in my chest. I couldn't understand why he couldn't see what I was trying to explain. Why couldn't he at least try to change his behavior? Why couldn't he hear me, not take my words seriously? With every word he spoke, I felt my faith in us crumble. It was like trying to breathe air into an empty bottle. I couldn't continue to make excuses for his behavior. I couldn't remain silent any longer, hoping that everything would somehow fix itself. There was no regret in his words, no desire to understand what I was going through. I was beginning to realize that he and I were in different worlds. Then, at that moment, when I was trying to find the strength not to give up, one terrible realization came to me. I can't continue living like this. I couldn't be with a person who couldn't understand me, couldn't even try to do anything for our relationship. It was as if we were standing on different banks, and despite all our attempts to reach each other, we couldn't overcome this gap. When I brought it up again, his response was the same as before. He said that this was the way he was, and that if I couldn't accept it, then maybe we should think about the future. The words sounded like a death sentence, and I felt my heart squeeze. But instead of swallowing his words again, I realized that this was the moment for me. I couldn't close my eyes to reality any longer. I couldn't hope any longer that he would ever change, that our relationship would somehow become what I had imagined. It was excruciating. I didn't want to leave him, but I couldn't stay in a relationship that was bringing me more pain than joy. I knew that maybe my expectations were too high, but I also knew that I couldn't neglect my own feelings and dignity. My confession was liberating, but it was also the beginning of the end. I could no longer hold myself in this relationship without faith that something would change. I felt this moment of liberation fill me with determination, albeit with pain that was unbearable. I knew that there would be hardships ahead, but in that moment I felt that I was taking the right step, a step towards myself. Saying goodbye doesn't always happen the moment we decide to break up. It often starts much earlier, at the moment when we begin to realize that we are in a relationship that doesn't bring us happiness. We try to find excuses, explanations, hoping that one day everything will work out. And when that one day comes, you realize that you can't return to what was before. The moment I made the decision that we needed to break up wasn't easy. It was painful, and I felt lost. My mind was spinning with thoughts about leaving behind not only the man I once loved, but also the entire world we had built together. Moments of happiness, joy, and even those moments when I hoped that he would finally change and everything would be like before. All of that was leaving, dissolving in the emptiness that was left after this decision. I was sitting in the room, and outside the window it was already evening. Dark clouds were slowly moving across the sky, as if reflecting my feelings. I knew that this evening would be a turning point. He was home, but we barely communicated. I repeated over and over in my head how to tell him that my feelings had changed, how to convey to him that I could no longer live in this tension, in these unspoken words and constant misunderstandings. When I walked into his room, I was ready. My heart was beating faster, but the fear I had felt before was gone. I knew that this was what I had to do, that I deserved to be happy, and in a relationship where my feelings were valued and taken seriously. "We need to talk," I said, and those words were the moment I stopped living in illusions. He looked at me with worry in his eyes, but I could see that he knew what I was going to say. There was no surprise in his eyes, only weariness. It was probably more painful than I could have imagined. I explained to him that I was hurt, that I could no longer continue to be in a relationship where I felt alone. I told him how his reactions to my feelings, his inattention and coldness made me doubt myself, and that we could ever be happy. I didn't try to blame him. I knew that not all of his actions were intentional, but that didn't change the fact that I could no longer live in such uncertainty. His face became even more closed, and I saw a shadow of regret pass through his eyes. But despite this, he did not try to justify himself. He listened to me silently, and then, as always, said that he apologized, but did not understand how to change what I was presenting to him. It did not matter anymore. I did not expect him to change. I accepted that I could not force him to be different, and this was liberating. After that conversation, I felt like a huge weight had been lifted off me. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew it was the right decision. He wasn't a bad person, but our paths had diverged. We couldn't be together anymore because our expectations and needs didn't match. We couldn't continue to drag each other along, torn between what we had and what we wanted to have. I returned to my room, and sitting on my bed, I finally allowed myself to relax. My breathing became easier, and although I did not feel the joy of separation, I felt that I had taken the right step. There was an emptiness inside me, but it was an empty place that would soon be filled with something new. I understood that a new path, new opportunities awaited me. I was ready to find myself, to build my life, without looking back. Saying goodbye was hard, but the release I felt afterward was so much more powerful. I knew I could handle it. I learned to let go, and that was an important lesson. Not everything in life is meant to stay forever. Sometimes you have to let go to find something more valuable yourself. In the following days, I felt a lightness that I hadn't felt in a long time. I started to think again about what was important to me. I remembered how before he came into my life, I made plans, followed my goals, and dreamed. Now I could do what brought me joy and peace again. Everything I had experienced became part of my journey, but I was no longer a person who was afraid of change. Every day I believed more and more that in the future I would be more confident, more independent. And although there was a lot of uncertainty ahead, I knew that it was this uncertainty that gave me freedom, the freedom to be myself, the freedom to choose my own path. And maybe one day I would meet a person again who would be there for me, without making me doubt myself. But for now, I was ready to move forward alone.